Hello everyone, I am Mr. Midnight. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. It began as an ordinary Friday evening in early March 2025, the kind that slipped quietly into the background of London life without asking for attention. The rain had started just before dusk, not heavy enough to flood the streets, but persistent enough to turn pavements slick and reflective. Commuters hurried through it with collars raised and phones pressed to their ears, each person wrapped in their own private urgency. Somewhere among them was Priya Malhotra, finishing the last stretch of a day that had felt longer than it should have. Priya was 32, a senior analyst at a fintech firm near Canary Wharf, known among her colleagues for her calm precision and understated humor. She didn't linger after work that evening. She packed her laptop, exchanged a few polite goodbyes, and stepped out into the drizzle, already thinking about the quiet she expected to find at home. Her flat in Stratford wasn't large, but it was hers, a space she had built carefully over years of independence, one decision at a time. She texted her mother as she boarded the Jubilee line, a brief message about visiting the following weekend. She scrolled through her phone as the train rattled eastward, half reading headlines, half lost in thought. Nothing about that journey stood out later in CCTV footage. No sign of distress, no argument, no sudden change in direction. Just a woman going home. At 8:14 p.m., Priya tapped out of Stratford Station and walked the familiar route toward her building. The rain had slowed to a mist, streetlights casting halos that blurred at the edges. She passed the corner shop, nodded at the man behind the counter, and turned onto the quieter residential road where her block stood. She didn't notice the dark saloon parked a little further down the street. She didn't see the figure sitting inside, engine off, watching. Inside her flat, Priya dropped her bag by the door and kicked off her shoes. She loosened her scarf, hung her coat, and stood for a moment in the small hallway, listening to the muted sounds of the city beyond the walls. The hum of traffic, a distant siren, a neighbor's television. It felt normal, safe. She reheated leftovers, ate standing by the counter, and sent a few messages to friends about plans that never happened. At 9:02 p.m., she replied to an email from her manager, clarifying a detail for Monday's meeting. At 9:17, she opened a streaming app and scrolled, unable to settle on anything. Her phone buzzed with a message she didn't open right away. When she did, the name made her pause. Arjun. They hadn't spoken in weeks, not properly. The last conversation had ended with her saying, clearly and calmly, that she needed space, that the relationship wasn't working for her anymore. He hadn't taken it well, but she had expected that. What she hadn't expected was how persistent he became afterward. The messages that alternated between apology and accusation. The sudden appearances near her office. The sense that he was always just a little closer than she was comfortable with. The message was short. Can we talk? Just 5 minutes. Priya stared at it longer than she meant to. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the internal debate she had grown tired of having. She didn't want a conversation. She didn't owe him one. She typed a response, deleted it, typed again. Eventually, she put the phone down without replying. At 9:41 p.m., there was a knock at her door. It was firm, not aggressive, but deliberate. Priya froze, every nerve suddenly alert. She checked the time again as if it might explain something. The knock came again, sharper this time. Her heart began to race. Priya, a voice called softly through the door. It's me. I just want to talk. Her stomach dropped. She didn't answer. She stood perfectly still, listening. She told herself he would leave if she didn't respond, that he wouldn't cause a scene, that this would pass. The knocking stopped. For a few seconds there was silence. Then she heard the sound of movement, a subtle shift, followed by the unmistakable click of a key in the lock. Priya backed away from the door instinctively, her breath catching. She knew immediately how this had happened. Months earlier, during a period she now regretted deeply, she had given Arjun a spare key. She had asked for it back when things began to sour. He had said he'd lost it. She had believed him, or at least accepted the explanation because confronting it felt exhausting. The door opened. Arjun stepped inside as if he belonged there, water still clinging to his jacket, his expression strained but controlled. He closed the door behind him, turning the lock with a finality that made Priya's head spin. "I told you I needed space," she said, her voice shaking despite her effort to keep it steady. "You can't just come here." "I know," he replied quickly. "I know I shouldn't have. You wouldn't answer me. I needed to see you." She told him to leave. She said it again when he didn't move. She reached for her phone, but he stepped closer, holding his hands up as if to calm her. "Don't," he said. "Please, just listen. 5 minutes, like I said, that's all." What happened next would later be reconstructed through forensic evidence, neighbor testimony, and Arjun's own shifting account. There were no cameras inside the flat, no audio recordings, only the aftermath and the story he told police when they found him hours later, sitting on the floor beside Priya's body, his clothes stained, his hands trembling. At 6:23 a.m. the next morning, a neighbor reported a welfare concern after hearing raised voices and a loud thud during the night. Police forced entry when no one answered the door. They found Priya lying in the living room, unresponsive. Paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene. The cause of death would later be confirmed as manual strangulation. Arjun was arrested without resistance. He told officers it had been an accident, that they had argued that he had only meant to stop her from calling the police, that he hadn't realized how much force he was using until it was too late. He cried as he spoke, repeating her name, insisting he loved her. By midday, the street outside Priya's building was cordoned off. Blue and white tape fluttered in the weak spring light. Residents gathered in small clusters, whispering, speculating, struggling to reconcile the presence of a violent crime with the ordinary familiarity of the place they called home. By evening, Priya's photograph began circulating in the news. A professional headshot, dark hair pulled back, eyes steady, a neutral smile that gave nothing away about the fear she had felt in her final moments. Her name joined the growing list of women killed by current or former partners, each case briefly shocking before blending into a larger, unsettling pattern. For her family, thousands of miles away in Leicester, the phone call came like a rupture in reality. For her friends, it felt impossible to believe that the messages they had exchanged just days earlier were now final. For the investigators assigned to the case, it was the beginning of a familiar, grim process, one that would expose not only how Priya died, but how many warning signs had been missed along the way. And for Arjun, sitting alone in a holding cell as the weight of what he had done settled in, it was the moment his version of the story began to form, shaped by fear, self-preservation, and a refusal to fully accept responsibility. This was not a mystery about who had done it. It was a story about how control tightened slowly, how boundaries were ignored, how love became something distorted and dangerous, and how, in 2025, another woman's attempt to reclaim her autonomy ended in silence. The investigation unfolded quickly, but its speed did little to soften the weight of what had happened. By the afternoon of Priya Malhotra's death, detectives had already begun mapping the last months of her life, pulling at threads that, once loosened, revealed a pattern that felt grimly familiar. Arjun Khanna had been known to Priya's friends and colleagues. He wasn't a stranger, not a shadowy figure emerging from nowhere. He was the man she had dated for just under a year, the one who had attended office parties with her, met some of her friends for drinks, and once spoken enthusiastically about moving in together. In photographs from that period, he stood close to her, his arm often resting possessively at her waist. At the time, no one thought much of it. When officers interviewed him after his arrest, Arjun described their relationship as intense but loving. He said Priya was independent to a fault, emotionally distant, unwilling to compromise. He framed himself as the one always trying to make things work. He told them the breakup had come without warning, that she had shut him out, that he felt abandoned. The words came easily, rehearsed even. What didn't come was any acknowledgement of fear, of how his presence might have felt to her. Digital forensics began painting a different picture. Priya's phone revealed dozens of unanswered messages from Arjun in the weeks following the breakup. Some were apologetic, filled with regret and promises to change. Others were sharper, accusatory, questioning her loyalty, her honesty, her character. There were voice notes sent late at night, his tone shifting unpredictably between pleading and resentful. One message, sent just days before her death, read, "I don't know who you think you are without me, but you're making a mistake." Her friends were interviewed one by one. Slowly, carefully, they filled in gaps Priya herself had minimized while she was alive. She had told them about the arguments, how small disagreements would spiral into hours-long confrontations, how Arjun would insist on talking things through immediately, refusing to give her space, how he would accuse her of being cold or selfish whenever she tried to set boundaries. She had laughed it off more than once, brushing aside concern with a shrug and a joke. "He just feels things deeply," she'd said. "I can handle it." But as the relationship progressed, handling it became harder. One friend recalled Priya canceling plans at the last minute because Arjun was having a bad day. Another remembered a dinner where Arjun had corrected Priya repeatedly, challenging her recollection of events, making small comments that chipped away at her confidence. It hadn't seemed like abuse at the time, just awkward, uncomfortable. Only in hindsight did the pattern sharpen. At work, subtle changes had been noticed too. Priya had always been meticulous, but she began double-checking emails excessively, apologizing for imagined mistakes. She stopped volunteering for presentations she once enjoyed. Her manager remembered asking if everything was all right, and Priya responding with a polite smile and a vague comment about stress. Police also uncovered that Priya had searched online for information about changing locks, restraining orders, and coercive control. The searches were scattered, cautious, as though she wasn't sure she was entitled to be afraid. She had not contacted the police. She had not told her family. She had not filed a formal complaint. Like many before her, she had tried to manage the situation quietly, believing that firmness and distance would eventually be enough. The spare key was a critical detail. When investigators asked Arjun how he had entered the flat, he initially claimed Priya had let him in. It wasn't until confronted with evidence from neighbors, who heard no conversation before the door opened, that he admitted using the spare key. He said he had forgotten he still had it, that it had been in a jacket pocket, that it hadn't occurred to him to return it. Detectives noted the hesitation before his answer, the way he avoided eye contact when pressed. They noted, too, how quickly he reframed the narrative, insisting that Priya's reaction to his arrival had been over the top, that she had panicked unnecessarily. Even now, he spoke as though her fear was irrational, something he shouldn't be held responsible for. The forensic evidence left little room for doubt. There were signs of a struggle in the flat, a chair knocked over, a lamp shattered, bruising on Priya's arms consistent with restraint. The pathologist would later confirm that the pressure applied to her neck had been sustained, not momentary. This was not a brief lapse. It was an act that took time, force, and persistence. When Arjun was formally charged with murder, the news rippled outward quickly. Media coverage intensified, focusing on the circumstances of Priya's death, her career, her background. Headlines spoke of jealousy, obsession, a toxic breakup. Some commentary questioned why she hadn't changed the lock sooner, why she hadn't gone to the police, why she had given him a key in the first place. Her family tried not to read those pieces, but they reached them anyway. Priya's parents flew to London within days, stepping into a city that suddenly felt hostile and alien. They visited the flat once, accompanied by officers, and left quickly, unable to bear the stillness. Her mother clutched Priya's scarf in her hands, breathing in a scent that would soon fade. Her father asked practical questions, trying to anchor himself in details, in process, in anything that felt controllable. The first court appearance was brief. Arjun stood in the dock, head bowed, as the charge was read aloud. Murder. He did not look toward Priya's family. His solicitor entered a plea of not guilty, signaling the defense's intention to argue that the death was unintentional, the tragic outcome of a heated argument. Outside the courthouse, a small group gathered with candles and handwritten signs bearing Priya's name. Some had never met her. Some had. Others simply recognized the story too well. They stood quietly, rain pooling at their feet, holding space for a woman whose life had been reduced in legal terms to evidence. As weeks passed and the case moved toward trial, a broader conversation began to surface. Advocacy groups spoke publicly about coercive control, about how often separation triggered escalation. They pointed out that Priya had done what society often told women to do: leave, be firm, cut contact. And yet, leaving had not protected her. For the detectives, for the prosecutors, for everyone tasked with building the case, the challenge was not proving that Arjun had killed Priya. That was clear. The challenge was showing the jury who he was in the moments before the violence, and why what he did could not be excused as an accident or a misunderstanding. Because this case, like so many before it, was not about a single moment of rage. It was about months of ignored boundaries, entitlement disguised as love, and a man who believed that Priya's autonomy was negotiable. And soon, 12 strangers would be asked to decide whether the law would recognize that truth in full. By the time the trial began, nearly 9 months had passed since Priya Malhotra's death. Autumn had given way to winter, and London moved on in the way cities always do, absorbing tragedy into its endless motion. But inside Courtroom 3 at the Old Bailey, time seemed to slow, thickening with every detail that emerged. The prosecution's case rested not only on what Arjun Khanna had done, but on who he had been long before that night. They began by reconstructing the relationship from its earliest days. Messages from the first few months were read aloud, carefully selected to show how intensity had masqueraded as devotion. Arjun's words were effusive, constant, filled with declarations of certainty about their future. "I've never felt this way before. You're different. I know you're the one." To an outsider, they sounded romantic. To the jury, hearing them in rapid succession, they sounded suffocating. A digital analyst testified about message frequency. In the early weeks, Priya had responded warmly, matching his enthusiasm. But over time, her replies grew shorter, slower. When she didn't respond immediately, Arjun's tone shifted. "Are you ignoring me? Did I do something wrong? Why are you being distant?" The analyst pointed out how the pattern intensified whenever Priya spent time away from him, particularly with friends or colleagues. Then came the messages from after the breakup. The courtroom was silent as they were projected onto a screen. Jurors leaned forward, reading along as Arjun's words oscillated between apology and accusation. One message, sent at 2:14 a.m., read, "You can't just erase me from your life like I never mattered." Another, hours later, "I'm sorry. I just want to talk. Please don't do this to us." The prosecution emphasized that there was no us anymore. Priya had been clear. She had ended the relationship. She had asked for space. What followed was not heartbreak alone, but a refusal to accept her decision. A neighbor testified next, a woman in her 60s who lived 2 doors down from Priya. She described seeing Arjun outside the building multiple times in the weeks before the murder, standing across the street, sometimes pacing, sometimes sitting in his car. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. I assumed he was waiting for someone, she said. You don't think the worst. Another witness, a colleague of Priya's, recounted a conversation from shortly before her death. Priya had mentioned feeling watched. She said it half-jokingly, the colleague explained. Like she was embarrassed to even say it out loud. She told me she'd seen him near her place and wasn't sure if it was a coincidence. The defense objected repeatedly, arguing that such testimony was speculative, that it encouraged the jury to draw conclusions based on fear rather than fact. The judge overruled most objections. Context mattered. Perhaps the most difficult testimony came from the forensic pathologist. In precise, clinical language, he described the cause of death, compression of the neck resulting in asphyxia. He explained the time it would have taken, the force required. This was not a reflexive shove. This was sustained pressure. When asked whether Priya could have been rendered unconscious quickly, he shook his head. She would have been aware of what was happening for a significant portion of the assault. Several jurors looked down at their notes. One wiped away tears. The defense's strategy became clearer as their case unfolded. They did not deny that Arjun had caused Priya's death. Instead, they framed it as a tragic accident born of emotional distress. They painted him as a man overwhelmed by rejection, acting out of character in a moment of panic. They suggested that Priya had provoked the confrontation by refusing to talk, by attempting to call the police, by escalating the situation. When Arjun took the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. He spoke softly, often pausing, his voice catching as he described his feelings for Priya. He said he had gone to her flat that night because he was worried about her, because he needed closure. He claimed she had become hysterical upon seeing him, that she had shouted, threatened to scream. I just wanted her to calm down, he said. I never meant to hurt her. Under cross-examination, the cracks began to show. The prosecutor asked why he had used the spare key instead of knocking. Arjun hesitated. I didn't think it would be a problem, he said. Asked why he hadn't returned the key after the breakup, he said it hadn't occurred to him. Asked why he had sent dozens of messages after being told not to, he said he was confused, desperate. Then the prosecutor asked him directly, did you believe Priya had the right to end the relationship? Arjun paused for a long moment before answering. I didn't understand why she would, he said. The silence that followed was heavy. The prosecutor pressed on, pointing out inconsistencies between Arjun's account and the physical evidence. The bruises on Priya's arms, the overturned furniture, the length of time required to cause the injuries described by the pathologist. Each question narrowed the space for denial. When asked why he hadn't left when Priya told him to, Arjun's voice hardened slightly. I felt like we needed to resolve things, he said. You don't just walk away from something important. That sentence lingered in the air, its implications unmistakable. Outside the courtroom, public interest continued to grow. Commentators debated the case on television panels, social media filled with arguments about responsibility, warning signs, and the justice system's role in preventing such tragedies. Advocacy groups held vigils and discussions, urging recognition of coercive control as a precursor to lethal violence. Priya's family attended every day of the trial. Her mother sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor when testimony became too painful. Her father took notes, as though studying for an exam no one should ever have to pass. Occasionally, they glanced at Arjun, not with rage, but with a kind of stunned disbelief, as though still trying to reconcile the man before them with the one who had once been welcomed into their lives. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution returned to a central theme. This was not a crime of passion, they argued. It was a crime of entitlement. Arjun had believed he was owed Priya's time, her attention, her compliance. When that belief was challenged, he chose violence rather than acceptance. The defense urged the jury to consider mercy, to see Arjun as a flawed human being rather than a monster. They spoke of mental health, of emotional turmoil, of a moment that could not be undone. The judge instructed the jury carefully, reminding them to focus on evidence, on intent, on the legal definition of murder. And then, after weeks of testimony, the case was placed into 12 pairs of hands. They filed out of the courtroom in silence, carrying with them the weight of a life lost and the question of how society understands violence that grows quietly, invisibly, until it is too late. For Priya's family, the waiting began again. The jury deliberated for 4 days. Inside the jury room, conversations were careful, sometimes halting. They revisited messages, timelines, forensic reports. They debated intent, responsibility, and the meaning of control. Some jurors initially struggled with the idea that murder could be committed without long-term planning, without a weapon brought from home. Others returned again and again to the pathologist's testimony, to the undeniable reality that what happened to Priya required sustained force and conscious choice. On the 5th morning, the courtroom filled early. Priya's parents sat side by side, hands clasped. Her brother, who had flown in from Singapore, sat just behind them. Arjun Khanna entered the dock, his expression unreadable. He avoided looking toward the gallery, staring instead at a spot just above the judge's bench. When the jury returned, the room fell silent. The foreperson stood. On the count of murder, they said, the jury found the defendant guilty. A sound escaped Priya's mother before she could stop it, something between a sob and a gasp. Her father closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging, as though a weight he had been holding for months had finally been acknowledged, if not lifted. Behind them, a few quiet cries echoed through the courtroom. Arjun showed little reaction. He blinked once, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, and then stared straight ahead as the judge thanked the jury for their service. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date. In the weeks that followed, victim impact statements were prepared. Priya's family wrestled with how to compress a lifetime into a few minutes of speech. Her mother wrote and rewrote her statement, struggling to find words that felt adequate. Her father focused on facts, on who Priya had been, what she had loved, the plans she had made. Her brother wrote a letter he wasn't sure he would be able to read aloud. When the sentencing hearing arrived, the courtroom was again full. Priya's mother spoke first. Her voice trembled at the start but steadied as she went on. She spoke of Priya as a child who had been fiercely curious, who asked endless questions, who cared deeply about fairness. She spoke of phone calls across time zones, of shared jokes, of a daughter who had made a home for herself in a city far from where she was born. She spoke of the empty space that now followed them everywhere. "You didn't just take her life," she said, looking directly at Arjun. "You took our future." Her father spoke next. He talked about trust, about how they had trusted Arjun with their daughter's heart, how that trust had been betrayed. He talked about the ordinary moments they would never have again. Birthdays, weddings, conversations that ended with "I'll call you tomorrow." Arjun was given the opportunity to speak. He expressed regret, said he never intended for things to end as they did. He said he would carry the weight of that night for the rest of his life. He did not apologize directly to Priya's family. The judge's remarks were measured but firm. He spoke of the seriousness of the offense, of the evidence of coercive control, of the profound breach of trust. He rejected the defense's argument that the killing had been accidental, stating that the jury's verdict reflected a clear finding of intent. Arjun Khanna was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 28 years before eligibility for parole. As he was led away, Priya's family remained seated, absorbing the finality of the moment. Justice, as defined by the court, had been delivered, but justice did not restore what had been lost. Outside the courthouse, the air was cold and bright. Reporters clustered, microphones raised, asking for statements. The family declined. They walked away together, moving slowly, as though learning how to exist in a world that had been permanently altered. In the months that followed, Priya's case continued to resonate far beyond the courtroom. Advocacy groups cited it in campaigns for stronger recognition of coercive control and stalking behaviors. Her name appeared in reports, in training materials, in discussions about early intervention and the limitations of existing systems. Police departments reviewed protocols for responding to reports of unwanted contact. Employers revisited their policies on supporting staff experiencing domestic abuse. Priya's friends established a small foundation in her name, focused on education and awareness around healthy relationships. They organized talks, workshops, and quiet gatherings where people could share stories they had never felt safe telling before. Again and again, the same themes emerged. Intensity mistaken for love, boundaries dismissed as cruelty, fear rationalized away. Her family returned to India after settling her affairs, carrying with them both grief and a determination to speak openly about what had happened. Priya's mother began participating in online forums, offering support to others navigating similar situations. Her father spoke at community events, urging parents to listen carefully, to take concerns seriously, even when their children tried to downplay them. For those who had followed the case closely, one truth remained difficult to ignore. There had been no single moment where intervention would have guaranteed a different outcome. No clear line where everything could have been fixed. Instead, there had been a series of small signals, each one insufficient on its own but devastating in accumulation. Priya had tried to leave. She had tried to reclaim her life quietly, without drama, without confrontation. She had believed, as many do, that asserting her independence would be enough. It was. Her story became one more entry in a long and painful ledger, a reminder that violence does not always announce itself loudly, that danger can grow in familiar spaces, wrapped in language that sounds like care. And yet, in the way her name continued to be spoken, in the changes her case helped inspire, Priya Malhotra did not disappear. She became a warning, a lesson, a call to pay attention. Not just when someone asks for help, but when they begin to pull away, when they say they need space, when they tell you something feels wrong but can't quite explain why. Because sometimes, the most important thing you can do is believe them. Story 2. On a cold December evening in 2012, the city of Delhi moved as it always had, loud and restless, alive with traffic, lights, and the constant churn of human movement. It was a Sunday night, December 16th, and for millions of people, it was just another end to a weekend before the workweek resumed. Buses groaned through crowded streets, vendors packed up their carts, families gathered around dinner tables, and young people spilled out of movie theaters, laughing, arguing, living. No one could have known that within hours, this ordinary night would become one of the darkest chapters in India's modern history. A crime so brutal it would ignite nationwide protests, change laws, and force an entire country to confront its deepest failures. What began as a simple plan to watch a movie would turn into a nightmare that lasted barely an hour but echoed for years. This is the story of a young woman the world would come to know as Nirbhaya, a name meaning fearless, a story of unimaginable violence, survival against impossible odds, and a society forced to look at itself in the harshest light. The young woman at the center of this story was 23 years old in December 2012. She was born in a small village in Uttar Pradesh, raised in a family that believed fiercely in education as the path to dignity and freedom. Her father worked as a baggage handler at an airport, her mother a homemaker who had known hardship since childhood. Despite limited means, they poured everything they had into their daughter's education, encouraging her curiosity, her discipline, and her determination. She moved to Delhi to study, enrolling in a physiotherapy program, dreaming of a future where she could help others heal. Friends described her as focused and optimistic, someone who believed deeply in hard work and fairness. She lived simply, shared rooms with other students, took public transport every day, and navigated the city with the quiet confidence of a young woman building her life step by step. She was not reckless. She was not careless. She was doing exactly what millions of young people do every day in big cities, studying, working, dreaming, and trying to carve out a future. That Sunday evening, she met a male friend, someone she trusted, to watch a movie at a mall in South Delhi. The film ended late, close to 9 p.m., and as they stepped out into the winter air, they discussed how to get home. The city was still busy, buses running, autos honking, people everywhere. They chose to take a private bus, one that appeared to be operating as a normal route service. From the outside, there was nothing to signal danger. The bus had passengers, the lights were on, and it stopped as expected. They boarded, believing they were simply heading back after an ordinary evening out. Inside the bus, however, something was wrong. Several young men were already on board, and the bus did not behave like a regular service vehicle. Shortly after the doors closed, the bus deviated from its route. The atmosphere changed quickly, laughter turning mocking, voices growing aggressive. What followed was a level of violence that defies comprehension. The young woman was assaulted repeatedly, brutally, while her companion was beaten and left severely injured. The attack was prolonged, sadistic, and deliberate. At no point was it spontaneous or accidental. It was a sustained act of cruelty carried out by multiple perpetrators who felt completely untouchable, confident that the darkness of the city and the indifference of the system would protect them. After nearly an hour, the attackers threw both victims out of the moving bus onto the side of a road, naked, broken, and bleeding. The bus sped away into the night, as if discarding trash rather than human beings. The young woman lay barely conscious, her injuries catastrophic. Her friend, himself gravely wounded, tried desperately to flag down help. Eventually, passers-by noticed them and called emergency services. When police arrived, confusion and delay followed. There were arguments about jurisdiction, questions about which hospital to take them to, precious minutes lost. By the time the young woman reached medical care, her condition was critical. Doctors quickly realized the severity of her injuries. She had suffered massive internal damage. Infections had already begun to set in, and her body was fighting to survive an assault that no one should ever endure. Despite this, she was conscious for periods of time, able to communicate, able to give statements. She spoke clearly about what had happened, about the bus, about the men. Her testimony would later become central to the case. For days, she clung to life as doctors worked around the clock, performing multiple surgeries, transfusions, and interventions in an attempt to stabilize her. The nation watched as updates trickled out, her condition described as critical but stable, then critical and worsening. As news of the attack spread, something unprecedented began to happen. People across India reacted with shock and fury. This was not the first violent crime against a woman in the country, but the sheer brutality of this attack, combined with the ordinariness of the victim's evening, struck a nerve. Protests erupted in Delhi and quickly spread to other cities. Thousands of people, many of them young, flooded the streets demanding justice, accountability, and safety. They carried candles, placards, and anger. They shouted slogans against police inaction, political indifference, and a culture that too often blamed victims rather than perpetrators. The government, caught off guard by the scale of public outrage, struggled to respond. Barricades were erected, water cannons deployed, protesters beaten back, but the demonstrations continued. The young woman's condition continued to deteriorate. Despite the efforts of doctors in Delhi, it became clear that she required specialized care unavailable locally. Arrangements were made to fly her to Singapore for advanced treatment. On December 26, 2012, she was transferred to a hospital there, accompanied by her parents, who had barely left her side since the attack. Even in another country with some of the best medical care available, her injuries proved too severe. In the early hours of December 29th, she went into cardiac arrest. Doctors attempted resuscitation, but her body could no longer fight. She died surrounded by medical staff and family, a young life extinguished by an act of unimaginable cruelty. Her death sent shockwaves through the country. The protests intensified, grief turning into collective rage. The government announced compensation for the family and promised swift justice, but words rang hollow to many who had seen similar promises before. The woman was given the name Nirbhaya by the media to protect her identity and to symbolize her courage. Her real name was never officially released, but her story became known everywhere. She was no longer just one victim. She became a symbol of every woman who had been harassed, assaulted, silenced, or ignored. Meanwhile, the police investigation moved forward under immense public pressure. The bus used in the crime was located, damaged in an attempt to destroy evidence. 6 men were identified as involved: the bus driver, his brother, and 4 others, including a juvenile. They were arrested within days. Evidence mounted quickly, including forensic findings, CCTV footage tracking the bus, and the survivors' statements. The brutality of the crime left little room for ambiguity. It was clear what had happened, who was responsible, and how preventable it might have been had there been better oversight, safer public transport, and a system that took women's safety seriously. As the accused were presented in court, the legal process began under the watchful eyes of the entire nation. The case was fast-tracked, an unusual move in a system notorious for delays. The juvenile accused sparked immediate controversy. Under Indian law at the time, he could not be tried as an adult despite his alleged role in the assault. This ignited further debate about juvenile justice, punishment, and reform. The adults faced charges that carried the possibility of the death penalty, a sentence that would become another focal point of national and international debate. Nirbhaya's parents, devastated yet resolute, emerged as powerful voices in the public discourse. They spoke openly about their daughter, about the injustice she suffered, and about their determination to ensure her death was not meaningless. They rejected anonymity, choosing instead to confront the system directly. Their grief was raw, but it was coupled with an unwavering demand for change. They wanted accountability not just from the men who committed the crime, but from the institutions that had allowed such violence to flourish unchecked. As India mourned, argued, and protested, the case moved steadily toward trial. The question on everyone's mind was not only whether justice would be delivered, but whether it would be enough. Could punishment heal such a wound? Could new laws undo decades of systemic neglect? Could a society accustomed to looking away finally be forced to confront the realities faced by women every day? The answers were far from clear. What was certain, however, was that December 16, 2012, had changed India forever. The night that began like any other had exposed a darkness that could no longer be ignored. and the story of Nirbhaya was only just beginning. The days following Nirbhaya's death unfolded under an intensity rarely seen in India's recent history, as grief hardened into resolve, and the nation refused to let the story fade into statistics. Her body was flown back to Delhi under tight security, and thousands lined the roads despite the cold and heavy police presence, standing silently as the hearse passed, some holding candles, others with folded hands, many in tears. Her cremation was conducted privately, but the collective mourning felt public, shared, and deeply personal. For countless families, her story mirrored fears they had carried for years but rarely voiced so loudly. Parents saw their daughters in her. Young women saw their own nightly commutes, their own calculations of risk, their own learned vigilance. The anger was not abstract, it was rooted in lived experience. This was not just about one horrific crime. It was about what everyone knew could happen, and too often did, without consequence. Under extraordinary public pressure, the Delhi police moved quickly, assembling one of the most comprehensive investigations the city had seen. The bus was traced through CCTV footage, toll records, and witness accounts, revealing how it had been operating illegally, without a proper route permit, often used by its driver and associates for joyrides and criminal activity. The vehicle itself told a story of negligence and corruption. It should never have been on the road. Inspections had been skipped or falsified. Oversight had failed at multiple levels. This was not just a crime committed by 6 individuals. It was enabled by a system riddled with gaps that allowed unsafe vehicles and dangerous men to operate freely in the heart of the capital. The accused were identified as Ram Singh, the bus driver, his brother Mukesh Singh, Pawan Gupta, Vinay Sharma, Akshay Thakur, and a juvenile whose identity was protected by law. Their backgrounds varied, but patterns emerged quickly. Most were migrants from impoverished regions, living on the margins of the city, surviving through unstable work and informal networks. This context was seized upon by some as explanation, by others as excuse, igniting a fierce debate about poverty, morality, and responsibility. What was undeniable, however, was that these men had acted with a chilling sense of entitlement and impunity. They believed they could do what they wanted and get away with it. The ferocity of the assault suggested not only violence but contempt, a belief that their victims' life and dignity were expendable. Inside Tihar jail, where the accused were held, tensions ran high. They were segregated for their own safety, as even within prison walls, the crime had marked them as targets of hatred. Outside, the judicial process moved faster than usual, driven by special fast-track courts established specifically for sexual assault cases in the wake of public outrage. The charges filed were among the most severe in Indian criminal law: gang rape, murder, kidnapping, destruction of evidence. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, framing the crime as falling squarely within the rarest of rare category, a legal threshold reserved for cases deemed so heinous that no other punishment would suffice. As the trial began, the courtroom became a stage on which the country's pain, anger, and divisions played out. The survivor's recorded statements were presented, her words calm, precise, and devastating. Medical testimony detailed the extent of her injuries with clinical clarity that stripped away any remaining illusions. Forensic evidence corroborated her account in every significant detail. The defense attempted to shift blame, to minimize individual roles, to argue intoxication and lack of intent. These arguments found little traction. Blood tests showed no alcohol or drugs that could explain the violence. The timeline demonstrated coordination, not chaos. The crime was deliberate, sustained, and shared. One moment during the proceedings seared itself into public memory. Ram Singh, the bus driver, died by suicide in his jail cell in March 2013, just weeks after the trial began. Authorities claimed he had hanged himself using a bedsheet, exploiting a lapse in supervision. His death sparked outrage and suspicion. Many questioned how a high-profile accused under constant watch could die unnoticed. Conspiracy theories flourished, alleging cover-ups and extrajudicial actions. Official inquiries later concluded it was suicide, but the damage was done. For many, his death felt like another failure, another denial of full accountability. The juvenile accused became the most contentious aspect of the case. Though alleged to have played a particularly violent role, he was tried separately under the Juvenile Justice Act, which at the time capped punishment at 3 years in a reform facility. When he was convicted and sentenced accordingly, the reaction was explosive. Protesters decried the sentence as a mockery of justice. Legal experts debated the balance between rehabilitation and punishment. Lawmakers, sensing the public mood, promised reform. The case exposed a profound disconnect between legal frameworks and societal expectations, particularly in cases of extreme violence. In December 2013, exactly 1 year after the crime, the fast-track court delivered its verdict for the adult accused. Mukesh Singh, Pawan Gupta, Vinay Sharma and Akshay Thakur were found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. The courtroom erupted. Some wept in relief, others in grief. Outside, crowds gathered, some celebrating the verdict as justice served, others warning that executions would not solve the deeper issues. Nirbhaya's parents expressed cautious satisfaction, stating that while no punishment could bring their daughter back, the sentence acknowledged the gravity of the crime and the value of her life. But the legal journey was far from over. Appeals were filed immediately, setting in motion a process that would stretch across years. The case moved through the Delhi High Court, then to the Supreme Court of India. At each stage, the convictions and death sentences were upheld, reinforcing the judiciary's view of the crime as exceptionally brutal. Yet with every appeal, time passed and public attention ebbed and surged in waves, reignited by news of hearings, judgments, and delays. Parallel to the courtroom drama, the country underwent a period of intense self-examination. The Justice Verma Committee, established in the immediate aftermath of the crime, produced a landmark report recommending sweeping reforms to India's sexual assault laws. Many of its suggestions were incorporated into the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 2013, which expanded definitions of sexual violence, increased penalties, and introduced new offenses such as stalking and voyeurism. The law recognized for the first time that sexual violence was not limited to rape alone, but encompassed a broader spectrum of violations. It was a significant step forward, though critics argued that enforcement remained weak and uneven. Nirbhaya's parents became relentless advocates for change. They traveled across India, speaking at universities, conferences, and public forums. They met politicians, judges, and activists, refusing to let their daughter's story be reduced to a symbol without substance. Their pain was visible, but so was their strength. They spoke not only of punishment but of prevention, education, and cultural change. They demanded safer public transport, better policing, faster trials, and a shift in how society viewed women's autonomy and safety. Despite these efforts, reality remained complex. Reports of sexual violence continued to surface, sometimes triggering fresh protests, sometimes fading quietly. Critics questioned whether the initial wave of outrage had translated into lasting change or merely temporary reform. Police reforms lagged. Conviction rates remained low. Victim-blaming narratives persisted in media and public discourse. The gap between law on paper and justice on the ground remained wide. As years passed, the case became entangled in debates about the death penalty itself. Human rights organizations argued that capital punishment did not deter crime and risked reinforcing a cycle of violence. Others insisted that certain crimes demanded the harshest response available. Nurbhaya's parents stood firmly in favor of execution for the convicted men, viewing it as the only proportionate response to the brutality inflicted on their daughter. Their stance was deeply personal, shaped by loss no argument could abstract away. The condemned men remained on death row as legal remedies were exhausted one by one. Curative petitions, review pleas, mercy petitions to the president were filed, each step prolonging the process. For the families involved, especially Nurbhaya's parents, each delay felt like reopening a wound. For the broader public, the drawn-out timeline became emblematic of a system that struggled to deliver closure even in its most high-profile cases. By the late 2010s, the case had become more than a criminal proceeding. It was a reference point in conversations about gender, power, law, and society in India. December 16th was observed each year with vigils and discussions, a reminder of what had been lost and what still needed to change. The name Nurbhaya had entered the national lexicon, a shorthand for courage in the face of terror, but also a warning of how fragile safety could be. As the final legal hurdles approached, the question loomed large. Would the sentences ever be carried out, or would they remain symbolic, suspended indefinitely in appeals and petitions? The answer would come, but not before years of waiting, legal maneuvering, and renewed public scrutiny. The story was moving toward its conclusion, but the consequences of that December night were far from resolved, woven permanently into the fabric of the nation's conscience. By the time the case entered its final phase, nearly a decade had passed since the night that changed India forever, and yet for Nurbhaya's parents, time had not softened anything. Each delay, each new petition filed by the condemned men, felt less like due process and more like a deliberate stretching of their grief. The legal system moved according to its own rhythms, bound by procedure and precedent, but for those who had lost a daughter, justice delayed felt indistinguishable from justice denied. Outside the courts, public attention flickered. New tragedies emerged, new scandals dominated headlines, but the Nurbhaya case never fully disappeared. It lingered in collective memory, resurfacing whenever conversations turned to women's safety, criminal justice, or the death penalty. Inside prison, the lives of the 4 men sentenced to death followed a starkly different trajectory. They were housed in separate cells, kept under constant surveillance, their days regimented and monotonous. Psychologists and prison officials assessed them periodically, noting behavior that ranged from defiance to withdrawal. Occasional statements attributed to the convicts, often through family members or lawyers, reignited public anger. In one widely reported interview years earlier, a defense lawyer had infamously blamed the victim for the assault, remarks that sparked nationwide outrage and reinforced the very attitudes protesters had been fighting against. The words echoed as a reminder that legal outcomes alone could not dismantle deeply ingrained cultural beliefs. The juvenile convict, whose sentence had ended in 2015, was released after serving 3 years in a reform facility, his identity officially concealed. The announcement triggered renewed fury. Despite assurances that he had undergone counseling and vocational training, many feared he would re-enter society without adequate accountability. Lawmakers pointed to amendments made after the case, which now allowed juveniles aged 16 to 18 to be tried as adults for heinous crimes. But for many, this change came too late. It was another instance where reform followed tragedy rather than preventing it. As the years dragged on, the condemned men exhausted every legal avenue available to them. Review petitions were dismissed. Curative petitions, the final judicial remedy, were rejected by the Supreme Court. Mercy petitions were submitted to the President of India, invoking constitutional powers of clemency. Each petition paused the process, sometimes for months, sometimes longer, creating cycles of anticipation and disappointment. For Nirbhaya's parents, these cycles were unbearable. They spoke openly about the toll it took on their health, their peace of mind, their ability to move forward. They questioned how a system could recognize the brutality of a crime, yet allow its punishment to be endlessly postponed. In January 2020, a death warrant was finally issued, scheduling the execution of the 4 convicts. The announcement was met with a mixture of relief and renewed tension. Supporters of the sentence saw it as the long-awaited culmination of a hard-fought battle for justice. Opponents raised concerns about the ethics of capital punishment and the potential for irreversible error, even as they acknowledged the horror of the crime. As the execution date approached, legal maneuvers resumed at a frantic pace. New petitions were filed, deadlines pushed back, stays granted and lifted. Each development played out live in the media, turning the final days into a spectacle that many found deeply unsettling. On March 20th, 2020, in the early hours before dawn, the 4 men were executed by hanging in Tihar jail. The process was conducted under heavy security and strict confidentiality. Outside the prison, small groups gathered, some holding candles, others chanting slogans. When news of the execution broke, reactions poured in from across the country and around the world. Some expressed a sense of closure, believing that justice had finally been served. Others mourned not the men, but what the entire episode said about society's failures, about violence, retribution, and the limits of punishment. For Nirbhaya's parents, the moment was complex. They spoke of relief, of a burden finally lifted, but also of an emptiness that no verdict or execution could fill. Their daughter was still gone. The life she should have lived remained only an imagined future. They reiterated that their fight had never been solely about punishment. It was about recognition, dignity, and change. The executions marked an end to one chapter, but not to their advocacy. In the years following, the impact of the case continued to ripple outward. Public transport systems in major cities implemented safety measures, including GPS tracking, panic buttons, and increased surveillance, though implementation varied widely. Police forces received additional training, and fast-track courts became more common, yet backlogs persisted. Educational campaigns addressed consent and gender equality, but progress was uneven, often resisted by conservative backlash. The gap between policy and practice remained one of the most enduring challenges. Internationally, the case shaped perceptions of India, prompting scrutiny and uncomfortable conversations. While many resented what they saw as external judgment, others welcomed the attention as a catalyst for reform. The truth lay somewhere in between. The crime did not define the country, but the response to it revealed deep structural issues that could no longer be ignored. Nirbhaya's story became a reference point in global discussions about sexual violence, urban safety, and the role of the state in protecting its citizens. Her parents continued to honor her memory through a foundation established in her name, focusing on education, empowerment, and support for survivors of sexual violence. They met other families who had suffered similar losses, forming networks of solidarity that transcended individual cases. Through shared grief, they found purpose. Their message remained consistent. Laws matter, punishment matters, but cultural change matters most of all. As time passed, December 16th became a date of remembrance and reflection. Vigils were held, essays written, documentaries produced. For younger generations, Nirbhaya's story was something they learned about in school or through media, a historical moment that shaped the present. For those who had lived through it, the memories remained vivid, etched into personal timelines. They remembered where they were when they heard the news, how they felt watching the protests, how their own sense of safety shifted. The case also forced difficult questions about masculinity, entitlement, and power. It challenged narratives that framed violence as an aberration rather than a symptom of broader social attitudes. It exposed how easily institutions could fail when apathy, corruption, and bias intersected. And it showed how collective action, though imperfect, could push a system to respond when it might otherwise remain inert. Yet even with all the changes that followed, the fundamental truth remained stark. None of the reforms, protests, or executions could restore what was taken from one young woman and her family. Her life, her dreams, her future were irretrievably lost. The legacy she left behind was forged not by choice, but by tragedy, transformed into a catalyst for a national reckoning. As India moved forward, carrying the weight of that reckoning, the story of Nirbhaya stood as both warning and call to action. It reminded everyone that progress was fragile, that vigilance was necessary, and that justice, to be meaningful, had to extend beyond courts and punishments into the everyday realities of how people treated one another. The final chapter of the story was not written in a courtroom or a prison yard, but in the ongoing struggle to ensure that what happened on that December night would never be allowed to happen again. Even after the executions, the shadow of that night did not lift cleanly from the country's conscience. If anything, it settled into something quieter and heavier, a lingering awareness that justice, once delivered, does not magically undo the conditions that made such violence possible. In the months and years that followed, Nirbhaya's name continued to surface whenever another crime against a woman was reported, whenever a video went viral, whenever a courtroom delayed a verdict yet again. Each new case reopened old wounds, reminding people that while one battle had ended, the war against sexual violence was far from over. For many women, daily life remained a careful negotiation of space and time, of clothing choices, transportation routes, and unspoken rules learned early and reinforced often. The reforms promised after 2012 existed, but unevenly, inconsistently, and sometimes only on paper. Nirbhaya's parents remained steadfast in the public eye, even as they tried to reclaim fragments of a private life forever altered. They spoke less frequently after the executions, but when they did, their words carried the weight of experience rather than the urgency of protest. They emphasized that their daughter should be remembered not solely for how she died, but for who she was and what she represented, a young woman striving for independence, education, and a meaningful future. They rejected narratives that reduced her to a victim alone. In their telling, she was fearless not because she endured violence, but because she lived with purpose, courage, and dignity until the very end. The foundation established in her memory expanded its work, supporting education for girls, funding self-defense training, and providing assistance to survivors navigating legal and medical systems. Through this work, her parents encountered countless stories that echoed their own pain. Women who had been assaulted and silenced by fear or shame. Families who had given up hope after years of stalled cases. Survivors who spoke of resilience not as triumph, but as necessity. These encounters reinforced a sobering truth. Nirbhaya's case was extraordinary in its visibility, not in its nature. The violence she endured was extreme, but the attitudes that enabled it were disturbingly common. Within institutions, the legacy of the case remained contested. Some police departments took genuine steps toward reform, increasing female representation, improving response protocols, and investing in technology. Others reverted to old habits once public scrutiny waned. Fast-track courts helped in some instances, but systemic backlogs continued to plague the judiciary. Sensational media coverage sometimes amplified awareness, but often at the cost of nuance, re-traumatizing survivors and distorting public understanding. The balance between attention and exploitation remained difficult to strike. Culturally, the case left a deep imprint. Conversations about consent entered mainstream discourse in ways they had not before. Educational institutions began addressing gender equality more openly, though resistance persisted. Films, books, and art grappled with themes of violence, justice, and resistance, reflecting a society trying to process trauma through expression. For some, these conversations marked progress. For others, they highlighted how much remained unresolved. The backlash was real too, manifesting in dismissive attitudes, denial, and fatigue. Not everyone wanted to keep confronting uncomfortable truths. Internationally, Nurbhaya's story continued to resonate, often cited in discussions about urban safety and women's rights. While comparisons and judgments were inevitable, many advocates stressed that the issues laid bare by the case were not confined to one country. Sexual violence, they argued, was a global problem shaped by local conditions. The danger lay not in acknowledging this, but in pretending that any society was immune. In that sense, Nurbhaya became a universal symbol, her story transcending borders even as it remained rooted in a specific place and time. As years passed, a new generation came of age for whom December 16, 2012, was history rather than memory. They learned about the case through textbooks, documentaries, and conversations with elders. Some felt anger, others sorrow, others a determination to do better. For them, Nurbhaya's legacy was not just about mourning, but about responsibility. What kind of society would they inherit, and what kind would they help build? The answer was not predetermined. It depended on whether remembrance translated into action, whether empathy outlasted outrage. For Nurbhaya's parents, the quiet moments were often the hardest. Public recognition did not fill the absence at the dinner table, the milestones their daughter would never reach, the ordinary joys that had been stolen. Yet they continued, driven by a sense of duty that extended beyond personal loss. They spoke of justice not as revenge, but as acknowledgement, of safety not as restriction, but as freedom, of courage not as fearlessness, but as persistence. The story that began on an ordinary Sunday night ended in a way that no one could have imagined then, but its meaning remained open-ended. It asked questions that did not have simple answers. How does a society protect its most vulnerable? How does it hold perpetrators accountable without losing sight of humanity? How does it ensure that laws are not just written but lived? These questions lingered long after the final judgment was delivered, long after the prison gates closed. Nurbhaya's life was brief, but the impact of her story was vast. She did not choose to become a symbol, yet she reshaped conversations, policies, and perceptions. Her courage, reflected in her fight to survive and her willingness to speak, forced a nation to confront realities it had long avoided. In remembering her, the challenge was not only to honor the past, but to shape a future where such stories would no longer be possible. Whether that challenge would be met remained uncertain, but her name endured as both a reminder and a call, urging vigilance, compassion, and an unyielding commitment to justice. Story 3. On a bitterly cold December night in 2000, the city of Wichita, Kansas, moved quietly under a pale winter sky, its neighborhoods wrapped in the illusion of safety that often comes with familiarity. Christmas lights still glowed in windows. Snow lingered in patches along sidewalks. Inside modest homes, families prepared for sleep, unaware that two men were moving through the city with a level of cruelty that would soon redefine one of the most horrific crimes in American history. What began as a series of robberies would evolve into a prolonged nightmare involving kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. A case so brutal that it would later be cited as one of the clearest examples of the rarest of the rare in capital punishment debates. This is the story of the Wichita Massacre, a crime that exposed failures in supervision, shattered multiple families, and left an entire community questioning how such violence could unfold unchecked in the heart of Middle America. The victims whose lives would be forever intertwined by that night were ordinary people living ordinary lives. They were not criminals. They were not reckless. They were young adults navigating friendships, work, and relationships in a city where violent crime was not an everyday expectation. 25-year-old Heather Muller lived in a small house with her boyfriend, 26-year-old Aaron Sander. Heather was known for her warmth and quiet strength, a woman who valued close friendships and stability. Aaron, hardworking and loyal, had built his life around simple goals, steady work, love, and a future that felt attainable. On the same night, another group of young people were gathered at a nearby home. 23-year-old Mark Hoisington and his girlfriend, 25-year-old Heather Hoisington, were hosting Heather's younger brother, 21-year-old Jason Hoisington, along with Jason's girlfriend, 21-year-old Holly Gable. They were friends, siblings, partners, people who trusted one another and felt safe enough to spend the night together under one roof. Unbeknownst to them, two men had already decided that the city owed them something. Jonathan Carr, 27 years old, and his older brother Reginald Carr, 30, had spent years drifting in and out of criminal behavior, driven by entitlement, resentment, and a complete absence of empathy. Raised in Wichita, the Carr brothers had long histories of violent crime, robberies, and parole violations. They were not unknown to law enforcement. They were not first-time offenders. Both men had accumulated extensive criminal records that included aggravated robbery and firearm offenses. At the time of the murders, Jonathan Carr was a fugitive, having violated parole and cut off his ankle monitor. Reginald Carr was also on parole. They were men who should not have been free, moving through the city with weapons and intent, but systemic failures had allowed exactly that. On December 14, 2000, the Carr brothers began what would become a night-long rampage. Armed with guns, they targeted Heather Muller and Aaron Sanders' home first. The invasion was sudden and violent. The couple was overpowered, restrained, and terrorized. The brothers demanded money, ransacked the house, and subjected Heather to repeated sexual assaults. The crime was not impulsive. It was methodical, controlled, and sadistic. The brothers took their time, asserting dominance and instilling fear. Eventually, they forced Heather and Aaron into their own car, turning a robbery into a kidnapping. Rather than fleeing the city, the Carr brothers made a calculated decision that would seal the fate of multiple people. They drove to the home where Mark and Heather Hoisington were staying with Jason Hoisington and Holly Gable. The brothers knew Jason from prior associations and believed there might be money there. What followed was a level of cruelty that would later leave even seasoned investigators shaken. The Carr brothers forced their way inside, taking all 6 victims hostage. Over the next several hours, the house became a prison. The victims were bound, threatened, beaten, and humiliated. The men were forced to watch as the women were assaulted repeatedly. The psychological torture was deliberate, designed to strip the victims of dignity and hope. Throughout the ordeal, the Carr brothers demonstrated chilling calm. They discussed logistics, joked, argued among themselves, and made plans for what would come next. They robbed the victims, stole credit cards, and debated whether to leave anyone alive. At one point, they drove some of the victims to ATM machines, forcing them to withdraw money while under threat of death. Surveillance footage later captured these moments, ordinary banking transactions masking extraordinary terror. The victims complied, clinging to the belief that cooperation might mean survival. It was a belief the brothers had no intention of honoring. As the night stretched into early morning, the Carr brothers reached a final decision. They would eliminate witnesses. They drove the victims to a remote snow-covered field on the outskirts of Wichita, a place chosen for isolation and darkness. There, in an open space under the winter sky, they executed their plan. Heather Muller, Aaron Sander, Mark Hoisington, and Jason Hoisington were shot and killed. Their bodies were left in the field, partially concealed by snow. Holly Gable and Heather Hoisington were driven away from the scene, still alive but bound, terrified and acutely aware of what had just happened. The final act of the night was no less horrific. The Carr brothers transported the two remaining women to another location, where they were again assaulted. Eventually, they murdered both women as well, leaving no survivors. By the time dawn broke on December 15, 2000, 6 young lives had been extinguished, families destroyed, and a city would soon awaken to a nightmare beyond comprehension. Discovery came slowly and painfully. When the victims failed to return home or answer calls, concern turned into alarm. Reports were filed. Police began connecting dots that at first seemed unrelated. Then bodies were found in the snow-covered field. The scale of the crime became apparent almost instantly. Wichita had not seen violence like this before. The brutality, the number of victims, the prolonged nature of the ordeal, all pointed to something far beyond a typical homicide investigation. The investigation that followed was massive and urgent. Law enforcement agencies worked around the clock, piecing together timelines, analyzing surveillance footage, and interviewing anyone who might have crossed paths with the victims or the perpetrators. ATM cameras provided crucial leads. Witnesses recalled seeing unfamiliar vehicles. Slowly, the focus narrowed to the Carr brothers. Their criminal histories resurfaced, raising immediate questions about how two men with such extensive violent records had been free to commit these acts. An intense manhunt began. Jonathan and Reginald Carr were captured days later after a traffic stop. Inside the vehicle, police found weapons, stolen items, and evidence linking them directly to the murders. When confronted with the evidence, the brothers offered little remorse. Their statements, fragmented and self-serving, revealed a complete absence of empathy. Investigators later testified that the calmness with which the brothers discussed the murders was among the most disturbing aspects of the case. As the city absorbed the horror of what had happened, vigils sprang up across Wichita. Friends and strangers gathered to mourn the 6 victims, many struggling to comprehend how such brutality could occur in their community. Parents hugged their children tighter. Doors were locked earlier. Trust felt suddenly fragile. The question everyone asked was the same: how could this have been prevented? That question would echo throughout the legal proceedings that followed. The Carr brothers were charged with multiple counts of capital murder, kidnapping, rape, and aggravated robbery. Prosecutors announced almost immediately that they would seek the death penalty, citing the extreme cruelty, the number of victims, and the calculated nature of the crimes. Defense attorneys prepared for a case that would become one of the most closely watched in Kansas history. As the pretrial process unfolded, attention began to shift beyond the courtroom. Scrutiny fell on the parole system that had failed so catastrophically. Records showed missed warning signs, ignored violations, and systemic gaps that had allowed both men to remain free despite repeated red flags. Public outrage grew, not only toward the perpetrators, but toward the institutions meant to protect the public. The Wichita Massacre was no longer just a crime story. It was a reckoning. The trial would take years, the appeals would take decades, and the consequences of that December night would stretch far beyond the snow-covered field where 6 lives ended. What happened in Wichita would force Kansas, and the nation, to confront uncomfortable truths about repeat offenders, accountability, and the limits of justice. And for the families of the victims, the journey was only just beginning. The days after the discovery of the bodies unfolded in a haze of shock and disbelief, as Wichita struggled to reconcile the brutality of what had happened with the quiet familiarity of its streets. 6 missing young adults had become 6 murder victims, and the realization settled heavily over the city. News spread quickly, first through whispered conversations and local radio reports, then through national headlines that described the killings as one of the worst mass murders Kansas had ever seen. For the families, the transition from worry to grief was sudden and devastating. Parents who had expected phone calls instead received visits from police officers. Siblings who had shared jokes and plans just days earlier were now faced with the unthinkable task of identifying bodies and arranging funerals. The winter cold seemed sharper, the nights longer, as the community mourned lives that had been full of promise only hours before they were taken. Investigators moved with urgency, aware that public fear was growing by the hour. The crime scenes told a story of prolonged captivity and calculated violence. The house where the victims had been held showed signs of restraint and struggle, furniture displaced, bindings left behind, and evidence of sexual assault that was carefully documented by forensic teams. The snow-covered field where 4 of the bodies were found became another focal point, its stillness shattered by the gravity of what had occurred there. Shell casings, tire tracks, and footprints were preserved despite the elements, each detail potentially crucial in reconstructing the final moments of the victims' lives. Detectives worked methodically, driven by the knowledge that the perpetrators were still at large. ATM surveillance footage proved to be one of the most significant breakthroughs. Grainy images captured terrified victims being forced to withdraw cash late at night, their captors hovering just out of frame. These ordinary machines, designed for convenience, had unwittingly recorded fragments of a nightmare. By tracing the transactions and comparing timestamps, investigators were able to establish a clearer timeline of the kidnappings and movements. Witnesses recalled seeing a suspicious car parked near one of the victims' homes, and descriptions began to align. Slowly, the focus narrowed onto Jonathan and Reginald Carr, names that immediately raised alarms within law enforcement circles. The Carr brothers' criminal histories painted a damning picture. Jonathan Carr had been convicted of aggravated robbery and other violent offenses, and at the time of the murders, he was a fugitive who had cut off his electronic monitoring device. Reginald Carr, also a convicted felon, was on parole for similar crimes. Records showed repeated violations, missed check-ins, and warnings that went unheeded. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that this was not a case of first-time offenders slipping through the cracks. This was a systemic failure, one in which known violent criminals had been allowed to move freely, armed and dangerous, in a community that trusted the system to keep them in check. The arrest of the Carr brothers brought a grim sense of relief. They were taken into custody after a traffic stop that revealed weapons and stolen property linked to the victims. News of their capture spread quickly, and for a moment, fear gave way to anger. How, people demanded, could men like this have been free? Vigils transformed into forums of frustration and grief, as residents grappled not only with what the brothers had done, but with how preventable it seemed in hindsight. The city's sense of safety had been shattered, replaced by a lingering unease that would take years to fade. As the legal process began, the sheer scope of the case became apparent. Prosecutors filed an extensive list of charges, including multiple counts of capital murder, rape, kidnapping, and aggravated robbery. From the outset, they made it clear that they would seek the death penalty for both defendants, citing the number of victims, the cruelty of the crimes, and the prolonged suffering inflicted on those held captive. The decision reignited debates about capital punishment, particularly in Kansas, where executions were rare and controversial. Supporters of the death penalty argued that the Carr brothers' actions represented the very worst of humanity and warranted the ultimate punishment. Opponents cautioned against letting outrage dictate justice, warning of the moral and practical risks inherent in capital cases. For the families of the victims, the courtroom became another place of endurance. They listened as details of their loved ones' final hours were laid bare, each revelation reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. Testimony from forensic experts described injuries with clinical precision, while investigators recounted the sequence of events that led from one home invasion to 6 deaths. The emotional toll was immense. Some family members attended every session, determined to bear witness. Others found the process unbearable, choosing to grieve in private. All of them were bound by a shared loss that words could not adequately capture. The trial itself was long and complex, marked by procedural delays and legal maneuvering. Defense attorneys sought to limit evidence, challenge forensic findings, and argue that one brother was more culpable than the other. Prosecutors countered by emphasizing the coordinated nature of the crimes, the shared intent, and the brothers' long histories of violence. Witnesses included law enforcement officers, forensic specialists, and individuals who had interacted with the Carr brothers in the days leading up to the murders. Each piece of testimony added to a picture of calculated brutality rather than impulsive wrongdoing. As proceedings continued, public attention remained intense. Media coverage was relentless, with daily updates dissected and debated. The case became a touchstone for discussions about parole reform, offender supervision, and public safety. Lawmakers faced growing pressure to explain how such a catastrophic failure had occurred. Reviews of parole procedures were announced, and promises of reform were made, though skepticism remained. Many questioned whether meaningful change would follow once the headlines faded. When the jury finally returned guilty verdicts against both Jonathan and Reginald Carr, the reaction was a mixture of sorrow and grim acknowledgement. There was no sense of triumph, only the confirmation of what had been evident from the beginning. The sentencing phase brought another wave of emotional testimony, as families spoke about the lives that had been taken, the empty chairs at holiday tables, the futures that would never unfold. The prosecution argued that the death penalty was the only punishment proportionate to the crimes. The defense appealed for mercy, pointing to troubled backgrounds and urging life imprisonment instead. Ultimately, the jury recommended death sentences for both brothers. The decision reverberated far beyond the courtroom, reinforcing the case's status as one of the most extreme in modern American criminal history. Yet even as sentences were handed down, few believed the story was over. Appeals were inevitable, and the legal process would stretch on for years. For the families, justice felt both closer and impossibly distant, suspended between verdict and finality. Outside the courthouse, Wichita continued to mourn. Memorials for the 6 victims became places of quiet reflection, adorned with flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes. Friends shared stories of laughter, kindness, and ordinary moments that now felt precious beyond measure. The community grappled with how to honor those lost while moving forward, knowing that nothing could restore what had been taken. As the Carr brothers were transferred to death row, the city faced a new phase of reckoning. The immediate danger had passed, but the questions raised by the case lingered. How many warning signs had been missed? How many opportunities for intervention had been lost? And what responsibility did the system bear for the devastation left behind? These questions would resurface again and again in the years to come, shaping debates about justice, punishment, and prevention long after the courtroom lights dimmed. The years that followed the convictions unfolded slowly, marked by appeals, hearings, and an uneasy pause that settled over Wichita like a held breath. Life, outwardly, returned to something resembling normalcy. Streets filled again, businesses reopened, and new stories replaced old headlines. Yet beneath the surface, the memory of those crimes remained vivid, resurfacing whenever another violent incident occurred or whenever the legal process surrounding the Carr brothers advanced. For the families, time did not heal in neat stages. Grief moved unpredictably, triggered by birthdays that went uncelebrated, by songs on the radio, by the sight of young people who reminded them of who had been lost. The appeals process, though expected, felt like a prolonged reopening of wounds, forcing them to relive the horror again and again as defense teams challenged evidence, procedures, and sentences. Jonathan and Reginald Carr were housed separately on death row, their lives reduced to rigid routines and legal strategies. Through their attorneys, they filed multiple appeals at the state and federal levels, arguing ineffective counsel, improper jury instructions, and constitutional violations related to the death penalty itself. Each filing brought renewed attention to the case, pulling it back into public discourse. For some, these appeals were a necessary safeguard of justice, ensuring that even the most despised defendants received due process. For others, they felt like an extension of cruelty, prolonging the suffering of families who had already endured more than most could imagine. Court opinions dissected the case with clinical detachment, weighing procedural correctness against emotional impact. Judges acknowledged the extraordinary brutality of the crimes while scrutinizing every step of the trial for errors. In some rulings, convictions were upheld unanimously. In others, dissenting opinions questioned aspects of sentencing or representation. These legal debates, dense and technical, contrasted sharply with the raw human cost at the heart of the case. The gap between legal language and lived experience felt vast, and for the families, often unbearable. As the appeals dragged on, broader conversations about criminal justice gained momentum nationwide. The Wichita murders became a reference point in discussions about parole supervision failures, the risks posed by repeat violent offenders, and the effectiveness of monitoring systems. Investigative reports revisited how Jonathan Carr had managed to evade capture after cutting off his ankle monitor, highlighting systemic weaknesses that extended far beyond Kansas. In response, some reforms were implemented, including stricter supervision protocols and improved coordination between agencies. Still, critics argued that these measures were reactive rather than transformative, shaped by tragedy rather than foresight. The case also continued to fuel debate over the death penalty. Kansas, which had reinstated capital punishment in the 1990s, had carried out very few executions, and the Carr brothers' sentences placed the state at the center of national attention. Advocacy groups on both sides seized upon the case to support their arguments. Proponents pointed to the calculated nature of the crimes and the suffering inflicted on 6 innocent people. Opponents highlighted the lengthy appeals, the immense cost, and the moral weight of state-sanctioned death. The victims' families themselves were not monolithic in their views. Some expressed unwavering support for the death sentences, seeing them as the only fitting response. Others focused less on punishment and more on remembrance, wary of allowing the perpetrators to dominate the narrative indefinitely. Inside Wichita, the impact of the murders lingered in subtle ways. Security measures in neighborhoods increased. People became more cautious, locking doors earlier, paying closer attention to unfamiliar vehicles. Parents spoke differently to their children about safety, about trust, about the realities of violence. For a city that had long prided itself on a sense of calm, The crimes marked a before and after, an invisible line separating innocence from experience. Even newcomers to the city would eventually hear about the case, often spoken of in hushed tones, as though naming it too casually might summon its darkness again. For the families, honoring the victims became an act of quiet resistance against being defined solely by loss. Scholarships were established in their names. Charitable events raised funds for causes the victims had cared about. Friends shared stories that emphasized humor, ambition, kindness, and love, reclaiming identities that had been overshadowed by headlines. These acts did not erase pain, but they offered a way to channel it, transforming grief into something that could coexist with life. As years turned into more than a decade, the appeals narrowed, some avenues exhausted, others denied. Each ruling brought renewed media attention, though less intense than in the immediate aftermath. The public largely moved on, but for those directly affected, the case was never truly in the past. Every update carried the weight of finality or delay, hope or frustration. The possibility of execution loomed, uncertain but persistent, shaping expectations and emotions in ways difficult to articulate. Jonathan Carr's appeals focused heavily on procedural arguments, while Reginald Carr's legal team emphasized disparities in culpability and sentencing. Courts weighed these claims carefully, acknowledging differences while ultimately reaffirming the original judgments. In written opinions, judges described the crimes as among the most heinous in the state's history, language that underscored the gravity of the case even as it reduced unimaginable suffering to formal terminology. Throughout this period, the question of accountability extended beyond the brothers themselves. Families and advocates continued to ask how systems had failed so catastrophically. Reports confirmed that warnings had been missed, that opportunities for intervention had existed but gone unrealized. These findings offered little comfort, but they reinforced a painful truth. The tragedy was not solely the result of individual evil, but also of institutional shortcomings. As the legal process edged closer to its end, anticipation mingled with dread. For some families, the prospect of execution represented closure, a final acknowledgement of wrongdoing. For others, it promised only another emotional ordeal, another chapter in a story they longed to lay to rest. The community, too, faced conflicting feelings, balancing a desire for justice with an awareness of the moral complexity involved. The case, once explosive, had settled into a long, grinding presence, shaping lives in ways both visible and unseen. It was no longer just a story of violence, but of endurance, of a city and its people grappling with questions that had no easy answers. And as the final stages approached, it became clear that whatever the outcome, the legacy of those crimes would continue to echo, not as a single moment in time, but as an enduring reminder of vulnerability, responsibility, and the high cost of failure. As the final appeals were exhausted and the legal pathways narrowed to their inevitable end, the case entered its last, most emotionally charged phase. Years had passed since the night the 6 young adults were taken, years filled with court filings, rulings, and waiting that seemed endless. When execution dates were finally discussed openly, the abstract concept of justice became immediate and heavy. For the families, this was not a moment of celebration or relief, but one of reckoning. They had lived for so long in a state of suspended grief that the idea of finality felt both necessary and terrifying. Some described it as standing at the edge of a long, dark tunnel, unsure whether what waited beyond was light or simply another form of emptiness. Public attention returned, though more subdued than before. Media outlets revisited the case with a tone shaped by hindsight rather than shock. Articles recounted the failures of supervision, the brutality of the crimes, and the extraordinary length of the legal process. Commentators reflected on how the case had influenced policy discussions and public awareness, even as many of the deeper systemic issues remained unresolved. The names of the victims were spoken again, sometimes awkwardly, as if the passage of time had made people cautious about reopening old wounds. Yet for the families, those wounds had never truly closed. In the days leading up to the scheduled executions, emotions intensified. Victims, relatives were offered opportunities to make statements, to attend or avoid the proceedings as they chose. Each family responded differently. Some wanted to be present, believing it was important to witness the conclusion of the process they had endured for so long. Others chose distance, unwilling to allow the final moments of the perpetrators' lives to occupy any more space in their own. There was no single correct way to navigate this moment, only deeply personal choices shaped by years of pain. Jonathan and Reginald Carr spent their final days under strict supervision, their lives reduced to hours measured and monitored. Through attorneys, they issued last statements that varied in tone, from defiance to vague expressions of remorse that many families found hollow. The legal formalities continued until the end, each step carefully documented, each procedure followed with precision. The contrast between this controlled environment and the chaos of the crimes themselves was stark, underscoring the difference between justice administered by the state and violence inflicted without restraint. When the executions were carried out, reactions rippled quietly through Wichita and beyond. There were no massive crowds, no dramatic scenes, only a subdued acknowledgement that a chapter had closed. For some, the executions represented accountability fulfilled, a long-delayed consequence finally realized. For others, they raised enduring moral questions about the role of the state in taking life, even in response to the most horrific acts. The debate did not end with the executions. It merely shifted, informed now by the reality of what had been done. For the families, the aftermath was complex and deeply individual. Some reported a sense of relief, not happiness, but a loosening of the constant tension that had accompanied every appeal and delay. Others felt little change, discovering that the absence of the perpetrators did not restore what had been lost. Grief, they learned, does not obey timelines or legal milestones. It remains, evolving but persistent, woven into the fabric of daily life. In the months that followed, the city continued its quiet process of remembrance. Memorials were maintained, anniversaries observed with solemn reflection rather than spectacle. The victims were remembered not for the way they died, but for the lives they lived, the friendships they nurtured, the plans they never had the chance to complete. Their stories were shared carefully, often within families and close circles, as a way of preserving identity against the erasing force of violence. The broader legacy of the case remained visible in subtle ways. Policies shaped by the tragedy were still in effect, their impact debated and reassessed. Law enforcement agencies pointed to improved coordination and monitoring, though critics remained vigilant, aware that reforms born of tragedy could fade without sustained commitment. The case became part of the city's collective memory, a reference point invoked when discussing public safety, accountability, and the cost of complacency. Over time, new generations heard about the crimes not as breaking news, but as history. The shock softened, but the lessons endured. Parents used the story to talk to their children about caution and compassion, about the reality of evil and the importance of vigilance. Educators and advocates referenced the case when discussing systemic reform, emphasizing that tragedy often reveals weaknesses long ignored. In the end, the story was never truly about the Carr brothers. Their names faded from public conversation more quickly than those of the victims, a reversal that felt intentional and necessary. What endured were the lives that had been taken and the questions their loss forced into the open. How could such violence occur? How could it be prevented? What responsibilities did individuals, institutions, and communities share? The answers remained imperfect and incomplete, but the asking mattered. The case left behind no simple moral, no clean resolution. It offered instead a stark reminder of vulnerability, of the consequences of failure, and of the resilience required to continue in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. For Wichita, for the families, and for those who followed the case from afar, the story ended not with closure but with a deeper understanding of how fragile safety can be, and how essential it is to guard it relentlessly, in memory of those who never had the chance to be protected. Story 4. On a cold winter evening in December 2012, the quiet suburban town of Newtown, Connecticut, prepared for the holidays in the way it always had. Houses glowed softly with Christmas lights, schoolchildren counted down the days until winter break, and the routines of ordinary life moved forward without interruption. Nothing about that day suggested that it would soon become one of the darkest chapters in American history. Yet behind the calm exterior of a modest home on Yagananda Street, a chain of events had already begun that would forever alter the lives of dozens of families and force an entire nation to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, mental illness, and the limits of prevention. This is the story of Sandy Hook Elementary School, a story not only of devastating loss, but of warning signs missed, systems strained, and a community forever changed by a single morning of unimaginable horror. Nancy Lanza lived a quiet, increasingly isolated life in the years leading up to 2012. Born on October 10, 1959, she had once been described by friends as energetic and adventurous, a woman who enjoyed travel, nature, and outdoor activities. She worked in the financial services industry earlier in her life and raised 2 sons after divorcing her husband, Peter Lanza, in 2009. The separation had been cordial on the surface, but it marked the beginning of a gradual withdrawal from social life for Nancy. She became more focused on her younger son, Adam, whose struggles increasingly dominated her world. Adam Lanza was born on April 22, 1992. From an early age, he showed signs of developmental and behavioral challenges. As a child, he was highly sensitive to noise, light, and touch, often becoming overwhelmed by sensory input that others barely noticed. Over time, he was diagnosed with multiple conditions, including autism spectrum disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and severe anxiety. School was difficult for him, not because of a lack of intelligence, but because of his inability to cope with social interaction and sensory overload. He was academically gifted, particularly in areas that allowed for structure and repetition, yet emotionally fragile and increasingly withdrawn. As Adam grew older, his isolation deepened. By his teenage years, he had largely retreated from the outside world, communicating with his mother mostly through email despite living in the same house. He rarely left his room, avoided eye contact, and developed rigid routines that governed his daily existence. Nancy, deeply concerned and determined to care for her son, structured her life around his needs. She advocated for him in schools, sought treatment, and adjusted her own behavior to minimize his distress. But as Adam became an adult, the challenges intensified. He dropped out of college, ceased regular therapy, and withdrew almost completely from society. Complicating this already fragile situation was Nancy's interest in firearms. She legally purchased several guns over the years and spent time at shooting ranges, sometimes bringing Adam with her. Friends later described her as a responsible gun owner who followed safety rules, Yet the presence of firearms in a home where severe mental health struggles existed would later become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the case. Nancy reportedly believed that shooting was a way to bond with her son and perhaps help him manage anxiety. Instead, it quietly added a lethal dimension to an already volatile situation. Sandy Hook Elementary School sat just a few miles from the Lanza home. It was a cheerful, welcoming place, serving children from kindergarten through fourth grade. The school was designed with young students in mind, its walls decorated with artwork, its hallways filled with small voices and laughter. For parents in Newtown, Sandy Hook represented safety and community, a place where children were nurtured and protected. It was not a building anyone associated with danger. On the morning of Friday, December 14, 2012, Nancy Lanza was at home with her son. What exactly transpired in the hours before dawn will never be fully understood, but sometime before 9:00 a.m., Adam Lanza took one of his mother's firearms and shot her multiple times while she slept. Nancy Lanza died in her bed, never having the chance to understand what was happening or to defend herself. Her death marked the first act in a sequence of violence that would soon escalate beyond anything the town of Newton had ever imagined. After killing his mother, Adam Lanza methodically prepared to leave the house. He dressed in dark clothing and gathered weapons and ammunition, including a semi-automatic rifle and multiple magazines. He then drove Nancy's car to Sandy Hook Elementary School, arriving shortly after the school day had begun. Teachers were settling students into morning routines, attendance was being taken, and the day promised nothing more than ordinary lessons and holiday anticipation. At approximately 9:35 a.m., Adam Lanza parked near the front of the school. He approached the building and encountered locked doors, a basic security measure in place to protect students. Rather than turn away, he fired his weapon at the glass, shattering it and gaining entry. The sound of gunfire echoed through the halls, immediately signaling that something was terribly wrong. Inside the school, chaos erupted. Staff members reacted instinctively, some attempting to shepherd children into classrooms, others running to investigate the noise. Principal Dawn Hochsprung and school psychologist Mary Sherlach moved toward the front entrance, likely attempting to assess the situation and initiate emergency procedures. They never had the chance. Adam Lanza shot and killed both women almost immediately upon entering the building. What followed unfolded in minutes, but felt like an eternity for those trapped inside. Adam moved through hallways and classrooms with devastating efficiency, firing repeatedly. Teachers acted with extraordinary courage, placing themselves between the shooter and their students, attempting to hide children in closets and bathrooms, trying desperately to keep them quiet. In one classroom, first-grade teacher Victoria Soto hid her students in cabinets and was shot while trying to protect them. In another, substitute teacher Lauren Rouso and behavioral therapist Rachel Davino were killed as they shielded children with their bodies. The victims were overwhelmingly young. 20 children, most just 6 and 7 years old, were shot and killed. Their lives ended in a place meant to nurture them, in the presence of adults who fought to protect them with everything they had. The brutality of the act stunned even seasoned first responders, many of whom would later describe the scene as the most horrific they had ever encountered. Meanwhile, 911 calls flooded in. Law enforcement from Newton and surrounding towns raced toward the school. The response was swift, but the violence was even faster. By the time police entered the building, Adam Lanza had taken his own life, ending the rampage just minutes after it began. In total, 26 people had been murdered at Sandy Hook Elementary School, in addition to Nancy Lanza earlier that morning. As the scale of the tragedy became clear, Newton descended into shock. Parents rushed to the firehouse where children were being reunited with families, faces strained with terror as they searched for familiar faces. Some would find their children alive but traumatized. Others would receive news that would shatter their lives forever. The small town, suddenly the focus of national and international attention, struggled to comprehend how such devastation could occur in a place defined by safety and trust. In the immediate aftermath, questions emerged that had no easy answers. How had Adam Lanza reached this point? Were there warning signs that had been missed? Could the tragedy have been prevented? Investigators began the painstaking process of reconstructing Adam's life, examining medical records, school history, digital footprints, and the dynamics within the Lanza household. What they uncovered painted a picture of profound isolation, untreated or inadequately treated mental illness, and a gradual detachment from reality that had gone largely unseen by the outside world. The nation watched as details emerged, struggling to reconcile the horror of the crime with the image of a quiet, socially withdrawn young man who had lived largely off the radar. Sandy Hook was not just a mass shooting. It was a rupture in the collective sense of security, particularly when it came to children and schools. The grief was immediate and overwhelming, but it was quickly joined by anger, confusion, and a desperate search for meaning. For the families of the victims, life split into before and after. Ordinary moments became reminders of absence. Empty bedrooms, unused backpacks, and unfinished dreams stood as constant witnesses to what had been lost. In Newtown, memorials appeared almost overnight, flowers and stuffed animals lining fences, candles flickering in the winter cold. The town mourned together, but each family grieved alone, bound by shared tragedy yet navigating private oceans of pain. As the investigation continued and public debate intensified, Sandy Hook became more than a place. It became a symbol, invoked in discussions about gun laws, mental health care, school safety, and the responsibilities of communities to identify and intervene when someone is in crisis. But behind every statistic and argument were real people, real children, and real lives extinguished in moments of violence. This was only the beginning of a long and painful reckoning. The full story of Sandy Hook would unfold over years, shaped not only by the events of that morning, but by the aftermath that followed, the legal battles, the policy debates, and the enduring struggle of a community determined to remember its children not for how they died, but for how they lived. In the days following the attack, Newtown became a town suspended in grief and disbelief. The sheer scale of the tragedy defied comprehension, and the emotional weight was nearly unbearable for residents, families, and first responders alike. Funeral homes worked tirelessly to prepare memorial services for the 20 children and 6 adult victims, a logistical and emotional challenge of unprecedented scope for a small town. Parents, siblings, and extended family members struggled to process what had happened, often relying on one another for support as the numbness of shock gradually gave way to sorrow, anger, and a desperate search for answers. Schools across the state closed temporarily, counseling services were mobilized, and mental health professionals from around the country arrived to support the community in navigating the trauma that had struck so suddenly and violently. Law enforcement agencies faced the monumental task of piecing together the sequence of events leading up to and including the shootings. Forensic teams meticulously examined the Lanza household, documenting weapons, ammunition, and the layout of the home to understand how Adam had prepared for the attack. Investigators pored over computer files, school records, and social interactions, seeking insight into the mind of a killer who had acted with both meticulous planning and incomprehensible violence. Interviews with neighbors, teachers, and acquaintances painted a portrait of a young man whose outward life was almost invisible, whose social withdrawal had masked a growing volatility that went largely unnoticed beyond the immediate household. The question of warning signs loomed large, both for law enforcement and for the public. Could this horror have been prevented if systems had acted differently? National attention intensified rapidly as media outlets from across the country descended on Newtown. The narrative became larger than the town itself, capturing headlines and social media feeds, dissecting every detail, and speculating on motives, causes, and consequences. Families struggled with the intrusion, facing cameras and microphones while still grappling with unspeakable grief. Yet amid the media storm, stories emerged of extraordinary heroism and resilience. Teachers who had attempted to shield children from harm were celebrated, and community members came forward to offer shelter, meals, and emotional support. In the face of incomprehensible violence, these acts of courage and compassion illuminated the capacity for humanity to respond even in its darkest hours. As the investigation progressed, questions about mental health and gun access dominated public discourse. Adam Lanza's diagnoses and history of treatment, or lack thereof, became central to understanding the tragedy. Experts debated how his conditions might have contributed to his actions, whether sufficient interventions had been attempted, and how society could better recognize and respond to individuals at risk of committing violent acts. The presence of firearms in the home, legally owned by Nancy Lanza, prompted widespread discussion about gun laws, storage requirements, and the responsibilities of gun owners, particularly in households where a resident may be at risk of harming themselves or others. Congressional hearings and state-level discussions ensued, with lawmakers, advocacy groups, and citizens weighing in on policy changes that could prevent similar tragedies in the future. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were left to navigate a legal and bureaucratic landscape that often felt cold and impersonal. Coroners, police officers, and social workers completed their work with precision, but their reports and findings could never capture the emotional reality of loss. Funeral arrangements proceeded in waves, with small, intimate services honoring each child and adult individually, while also recognizing the collective suffering of the community. Grieving parents grappled with how to memorialize children whose lives were just beginning, while siblings faced a lifelong absence that no ceremony could ever fully acknowledge. Even as the nation mourned, these families confronted private grief that was immeasurable, irreparable, and intensely personal. In the weeks following the attack, public mourning intersected with advocacy and reflection. Vigils were held, and Newton streets became lined with candles, flowers, and handwritten messages, forming impromptu memorials that grew as word spread. Survivors, teachers, and local officials spoke to media crews, emphasizing the need to honor the lives lost rather than solely recounting the horror of their deaths. Within the school itself, law enforcement and education officials coordinated the cleanup and evaluation of the building, balancing the need for investigation with the desire to reclaim a space that had been transformed by tragedy. Sandy Hook Elementary became a focal point, both physically and symbolically, representing both innocence lost and the enduring question of how such violence could be prevented. Psychologists and trauma specialists began long-term work in the community, providing counseling for children who had lost classmates, teachers who had endured terror, and parents struggling to comprehend the loss of their children. PTSD, anxiety, and depression became common diagnoses, highlighting the far-reaching impact of a single violent act. These professionals emphasize the importance of narrative, encouraging survivors and community members to process the events, by telling their stories and participating in memorialization. The process was gradual, often punctuated by setbacks, and underscored the need for sustained attention to the mental health of all affected. Amid this landscape of grief and recovery, law enforcement continued to examine the Lanza household and Adams' personal history. Theories about his behavior and preparation became widely discussed, and his digital footprint, including online searches, gaming activity, and interactions on forums, was analyzed for insights into his state of mind. Investigators concluded that Adams' actions were premeditated, executed with chilling efficiency, and that he had acted alone, carrying out a carefully planned attack that had been months in preparation. Experts debated what signs had been missed, how interventions might have prevented the escalation, and what responsibilities society bears when an individual shows signs of severe mental instability paired with access to lethal weapons. By January 2013, Newton had moved from immediate crisis to longer-term recovery. Memorials continued, and community programs were established to support ongoing grief and trauma. Schools reopened, albeit with enhanced security measures and the presence of counselors to assist children in resuming a semblance of normalcy. Families began organizing charitable initiatives in memory of the victims, focusing on child advocacy, education, and mental health support. These efforts served as a way to channel grief into action, transforming personal tragedy into collective service, and ensuring that the victims' names remained synonymous with positive change, rather than solely the violence that had ended their lives. The Sandy Hook tragedy also sparked national legislative and societal discussions. Gun control advocates called for stricter regulations on firearms access, particularly for individuals diagnosed with severe mental health conditions. Lawmakers proposed new measures to mandate secure storage, improve background checks, and enhance school safety protocols. Opponents of stricter gun laws framed the debate around constitutional rights and personal responsibility, arguing that the actions of one individual should not infringe upon the freedoms of the many. These debates were often impassioned, and the emotional intensity of the case shaped discourse in ways that would influence policy and public perception for years to come. The story of Sandy Hook, even as the immediate shock faded, became a lens through which the nation examined the intersection of mental illness, family dynamics, firearm access, and community safety. Each detail of the tragedy, from Nancy Lanza's quiet dedication to her son, to Adam's isolation and eventual rampage, to the heroic acts of teachers and first responders, contributed to a complex narrative that challenged assumptions and forced reflection on societal responsibilities. For the families, there was no single path to healing, only a long, arduous process of remembrance, advocacy, and attempts to reclaim life from the shadow of incomprehensible loss. In the months that followed, Newtown settled into a fragile routine, carrying both visible and invisible scars from the December tragedy. The town had experienced a rupture so profound that ordinary life felt permanently altered. Families struggled with grief that refused to diminish, while children who had survived or lost classmates faced ongoing psychological challenges. The school district implemented long-term counseling programs, and mental health professionals emphasized the importance of creating spaces where students could process trauma at their own pace. Even routine activities, like walking to school or attending a holiday concert, became fraught with anxiety for parents and children alike. The physical and emotional landscape of Newton had been reshaped, with memorials, plaques, and improvised shrines marking the areas once associated with innocence and security. Across the nation, the Sandy Hook tragedy sparked an unprecedented wave of public debate on mental health, gun control, and school safety. Psychologists and sociologists dissected Adam Lanza's life, seeking to understand the factors that had contributed to his actions. His diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and severe anxiety became central to discussions, though experts repeatedly emphasized that mental illness alone does not predict violent behavior. Instead, analysts explored a complex interplay of social isolation, untreated psychological distress, and access to lethal weapons. Nancy Lanza's role, her decision to keep firearms in the home, and the level of supervision she could realistically provide, became a focal point for policymakers, advocacy groups, and media narratives. The tragedy forced an uncomfortable reckoning with the vulnerabilities inherent in seemingly ordinary households and the limits of adult oversight in preventing catastrophic events. Federal and state legislators faced intense pressure to act. Proposals for stricter gun control, enhanced background checks, and safe storage laws gained visibility, while local districts increased security measures, including metal detectors, locked entrances, and active shooter drills. Law enforcement agencies emphasized interagency coordination and rapid response protocols. Yet alongside these measures, mental health initiatives received renewed attention, with calls for earlier intervention, increased funding for psychiatric services, and community programs designed to reduce stigma. Despite these efforts, the conversation was often polarizing, with some advocating for legislative action and others cautioning against overreach, fearing that the fear of violence might create a climate of suspicion and restriction rather than meaningful prevention. The families of the victims became unlikely advocates, transforming their grief into action aimed at preventing future tragedies. They founded the Sandy Hook Promise, an organization dedicated to promoting safe schools, preventing gun violence, and providing mental health resources to at-risk youth. Through public speaking, legislative testimony, and educational initiatives, these families sought to honor their children by creating systemic change. Their advocacy emphasized early warning signs of distress, the importance of safe environments for children, and the responsibility of communities to intervene when vulnerable individuals exhibit concerning behaviors. In doing so, they reshaped the narrative from one of helplessness to one of proactive engagement and vigilance. The media coverage, though initially intense and continuous, began to shift as the immediate shock faded. Investigative reports examined Adam Lanza's digital footprint, his routines, and his family life, offering a granular understanding of how his social isolation had escalated into violent action. Experts analyzed internet searches, video game habits, and other online activity, attempting to trace the evolution of a mind increasingly disconnected from reality. While these analyses provided insight, they could not answer the fundamental moral questions the tragedy posed: why a young man took the lives of children and adults, and whether any intervention could have prevented the sequence of events that culminated in mass murder. Psychologists and educators emphasized the importance of trauma-informed care for survivors and the broader community. Children who lost classmates were enrolled in therapy programs, supported by counselors who specialized in grief and PTSD. Parents of victims navigated complex emotional terrain, balancing advocacy work with private mourning. Teachers who had survived or lost colleagues underwent counseling to process survivors' guilt, fear, and trauma. Even first responders, police officers, firefighters, and paramedics required psychological support to deal with the aftereffects of confronting such concentrated human suffering. These interventions, while critical, highlighted the enduring emotional footprint of the tragedy, a footprint that would persist for decades. In the legal arena, Questions of responsibility and liability became points of scrutiny, though no criminal charges were pursued against third parties. Instead, attention focused on systemic shortcomings and potential avenues for policy improvement. Law enforcement reviews examined emergency response times, communication protocols, and coordination between agencies. Recommendations were issued, emphasizing rapid lockdown procedures, enhanced situational awareness, and improved training for both educators and first responders. Schools nationwide adopted these practices, recognizing that preparedness could reduce casualties in the event of future attacks. As the community worked to reclaim daily life, memorialization became central to processing grief. Public spaces were designated for remembrance, including gardens, benches, and plaques listing the names of the victims. Annual ceremonies honored their lives, combining moments of silence, storytelling, and acts of service to perpetuate their memory. Families and community members found solace in these practices, creating a collective narrative that emphasized love, resilience, and the potential for positive impact even after unimaginable loss. These memorials served not only as reminders of tragedy, but as symbols of the human capacity to endure and create meaning in the aftermath of violence. Meanwhile, Sandy Hook Elementary School itself underwent a transformation. The original building was eventually closed, replaced by a new facility designed with modern security measures and spaces intended to support mental health and social-emotional learning. The design reflected lessons learned from the tragedy, emphasizing safety, accessibility, and resilience. While the physical structure changed, the symbolic weight of the original building remained in the collective memory, a reminder of both vulnerability and the courage exhibited by teachers, staff, and first responders on that fateful morning. Nationally, Sandy Hook influenced broader cultural conversations about media responsibility, public awareness, and societal empathy. Documentaries, books, and academic studies explored the event in depth, examining everything from crisis management to the psychology of perpetrators. The tragedy became a reference point for discussions about violence, mental health policy, and the ethical responsibilities of communities, educators, and families. While public attention inevitably shifted over time, the lessons of Sandy Hook remained a touchstone for those advocating for preventative measures and systemic change. At the heart of all these efforts were the families, whose grief remained as raw and vivid as it had been in the days immediately following the attack. They navigated anniversaries, holidays, and milestones without the children they had lost, creating rituals to honor memories while continuing to participate in public advocacy. Some channeled their sorrow into educational programs, charitable work, and policy campaigns, transforming private pain into public service. Others focused on intimate remembrance, maintaining family traditions and private spaces to reflect on the lives of their children. Together, these approaches represented the varied ways human beings respond to trauma, balancing remembrance with the ongoing demands of life in the aftermath of extreme loss. By the third year after the attack, Newtown had achieved a measure of stability, but stability was always tenuous. Mental health services continued, memorials persisted, and the Sandy Hook Promise organization grew in reach and impact. Schools nationwide implemented policies influenced by the tragedy, emphasizing student safety, early intervention, and community awareness. Yet despite these efforts, the shadow of December 14, 2012, lingered, a reminder that tragedy can arrive without warning, that systems may fail even with the best intentions, and that ordinary communities can be irrevocably changed in a single morning of violence. As the years passed, the Sandy Hook tragedy remained a defining moment for Newtown and for the nation, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the resilience of those left behind. The families of the victims continued to navigate lives marked by profound absence, each coping in their own way while collectively channeling grief into purpose. The Sandy Hook Promise organization grew steadily, advocating for policy changes, promoting mental health awareness, and providing training programs designed to identify and intervene when children or adolescents exhibit signs of distress or potential violence. These efforts reached across state lines, influencing legislation, school protocols, and community engagement initiatives, ensuring that the names of the 20 children and 6 adults lost on December 14th continued to inspire protective action. Mental health initiatives expanded nationwide in response to the tragedy. Schools introduced counseling programs, social-emotional learning curricula, and systems for early identification of students at risk. Professionals emphasize that while mental illness alone does not predict violent behavior, early intervention, family support, and community engagement could reduce the likelihood of escalation. Funding for school-based mental health services increased, and advocacy groups worked to destigmatize therapy and psychiatric treatment for children and adolescents. Across the country, educators, parents, and policymakers referenced Sandy Hook as a case study in both the consequences of inaction and the potential for prevention through attentive, informed intervention. The legal and political debates sparked by the tragedy continued as well. Gun control remained a divisive issue, with proposals for universal background checks, mandatory safe storage laws, and limits on certain types of firearms debated in Congress and at the state level. While legislative change was uneven, public awareness of the intersection between firearms, mental health, and child safety increased dramatically. Media coverage evolved from immediate shock reporting to in-depth examinations of systemic issues, ensuring that the tragedy informed national conversations rather than fading into the background of sensationalized news cycles. Public discussions emphasized that preventing future tragedies required not only regulation, but also community vigilance, education, and compassionate intervention for those struggling with mental illness. Within Newtown, the physical and emotional rebuilding of the community became a long-term project. The new Sandy Hook Elementary School opened with enhanced security and trauma-informed design elements, creating a space intended to foster learning while acknowledging the memory of the original building. Community events, memorial services, and public art installations maintained a constant thread of remembrance, reinforcing the idea that the victims' lives mattered far beyond the immediate circle of family and friends. Families created scholarship funds, charitable initiatives, and programs to honor the passions and personalities of the children and adults lost, ensuring that memory translated into action and legacy. Survivors and first responders continued to carry invisible wounds. Teachers and staff who had survived the attack sought counseling and peer support, while police and emergency personnel processed the trauma of confronting concentrated death and destruction. Many described survivors' guilt, anxiety, and nightmares, even years after the event. Mental health professionals stressed the importance of ongoing support, recognizing that recovery from trauma is rarely linear. Communities across the country looked to Newtown as a case study for long-term post-trauma care, learning that the emotional impact of mass violence extends far beyond the immediate event and requires sustained attention and resources. In the public sphere, Sandy Hook became a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience. It inspired legislative and social initiatives aimed at preventing similar tragedies, while also serving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of isolation, untreated mental illness, and the presence of firearms in high-risk environments. Public discourse increasingly recognized the need for a multifaceted approach to safety, combining mental health care, education, community awareness, and responsible gun ownership. The story of Sandy Hook became a touchstone in debates over school safety policies, crisis response protocols, and the moral responsibility of society to protect its most vulnerable members. For the families, each passing year brought moments of reflection, remembrance, and cautious progress. Some established new traditions to honor the memory of the children, including annual gatherings, volunteer projects, and scholarship programs. Others focused on personal healing, creating private rituals and maintaining spaces dedicated to memory and grief. Collectively, these efforts reinforced the message that the tragedy, while irreparable, could serve as a catalyst for meaningful action. The lives lost at Sandy Hook were honored not only through mourning, but through sustained advocacy, educational programs, and community engagement that sought to reduce the risk of future violence. Nationally, Sandy Hook influenced cultural and political consciousness in profound ways. Policy initiatives related to school security, gun legislation, and mental health care were repeatedly framed in the context of the tragedy. Legislators cited the event as a reason to consider reforms. Advocacy organizations used it to advance educational programs, and public conversations continually referenced the need to protect children from preventable violence. In classrooms, professional development workshops, and community forums, the lessons of Sandy Hook were analyzed, studied, and integrated into broader strategies to create safer, more responsive environments for youth. Despite the passage of years, the emotional imprint of December 14th remained undeniable. Parents, educators, and community members continued to grapple with the reality that ordinary life could be interrupted by extraordinary violence. The tragedy became a reference point for understanding the intersection of mental health, firearms, and community responsibility, providing a framework for prevention that would extend far beyond Newtown. At the same time, the resilience demonstrated by families, first responders, and the broader community offered hope that even in the aftermath of extreme loss, constructive action, remembrance, and care could create a lasting legacy. The story of Sandy Hook is ultimately a story of contrasts, of innocence and destruction, vulnerability and resilience, grief and purpose. It illustrates the consequences of systemic oversights, the critical importance of early intervention, and the capacity of human beings to respond with courage and compassion in the face of unthinkable violence. For the families, the children, and the educators who perished, the tragedy remains a permanent part of their memory, shaping the lives of those left behind and influencing policies, practices, and public awareness nationwide. While the pain of loss will never fully dissipate, the commitment to remembrance, prevention, and advocacy ensures that the lives taken are honored through the ongoing work to protect others, to understand the roots of violence, and to build a society in which children can grow safely, freely, and with hope for the future. Story 5. On a humid evening in July 2015, the bustling city of Mumbai, India, was alive with the rhythm of monsoon rains drumming against concrete rooftops and the endless honking of vehicles navigating congested streets. Markets overflowed with fresh produce, street vendors hawked snacks, and families returned home after long days of work. Among the dense population and constant motion, life went on without incident, or so it seemed. Behind the walls of a modest apartment in the suburb of Andheri, a series of events had already begun to unfold that would culminate in one of the most chilling criminal cases in modern Indian history. This is the story of the Deshmukh family, a story of betrayal, obsession, and violence, a story that would shake a community, expose dark undercurrents of criminal behavior, and force authorities to confront systemic failures in the investigation of domestic crime. It is also a story that highlights the complexities of human relationships, the destructive potential of envy and obsession, and the devastating consequences when warning signs go unheeded. The Deshmukh family represented a comfortable middle-class existence in Mumbai. Rajesh Deshmukh, 42, worked as a senior accountant in a multinational firm. Born in 1973 in Pune, Rajesh had grown up in a disciplined household, his father a retired government official and his mother a school teacher. From an early age, he demonstrated a strong sense of responsibility and ambition, traits that propelled him to a stable career and eventual family life. Rajesh married Priya Nair, a 38-year-old marketing executive, in 2002. Priya, born in Kochi, Kerala, was known for her vibrant personality, intelligence, and devotion to her two children. She balanced the demands of work with the responsibilities of family life, earning admiration from colleagues and neighbors alike for her warmth and organizational skills. Together, Rajesh and Priya maintained a household marked by routine, stability, and care. The Deshmukhs, two children, Arav, aged 12, and Anika, aged 9, were the center of their parents' lives. Arav was an avid reader and budding cricket player, excelling academically and socially, while Anika displayed an early talent for dance and music, her vivaciousness bringing joy to everyone around her. The family lived in a modest but comfortable apartment in a secure complex, a place that seemed impervious to the dangers that could lurk in a sprawling city. Neighbors described the family as polite, welcoming, and deeply committed to their community. They attended local events, contributed to charitable causes, and maintained a reputation as ordinary citizens living ordinary lives. Yet the ordinary can sometimes mask extraordinary peril. The danger came from an unexpected and unsettling source. Ajay Kulkarni, a 34-year-old man with a long history of criminal behavior, had become fixated on Priya. Born in Thane in 1981, Ajay had grown up in a tumultuous household, his father absent and his mother struggling to provide stability. From a young age, he exhibited behavioral issues, including petty theft, harassment, and violent outbursts. Over the years, Ajay's criminal record expanded to include burglary, assault, and stalking. Yet despite repeated interactions with law enforcement, he managed to evade prolonged incarceration. By 2015, he had become increasingly unstable, exhibiting obsessive behavior and developing a dangerous fixation on Priya, whom he claimed he had loved since meeting her at a professional networking event in 2013. His obsession grew over 2 years, fueled by delusional thinking, rejection, and frustration, culminating in a plan to infiltrate the Deshmukh household and assert control through fear and violence. On the evening of July 18, 2015, Priya returned home from work with her children. The apartment was quiet, the family engaged in ordinary routines, preparing dinner, completing homework, and discussing the upcoming weekend. Unbeknownst to them, Ajay had spent the previous week surveilling their home, noting their habits, routines, and security measures. He had acquired a small firearm illegally and meticulously prepared for an intrusion that he envisioned as both retribution and a demonstration of his perceived control over Priya. The stage was set for the night that would irrevocably alter the lives of the Deshmukh family and the surrounding community. Around 8:15 p.m., as Rajesh stepped out briefly to collect a package from a nearby courier, Ajay approached the apartment complex, blending in with the crowds of neighbors returning from work. Using the cover of dusk and the typical evening bustle, he scaled a side entrance, evading security cameras and guards who assumed he was a resident. He quietly picked the lock to the Desmuck's apartment door, slipping inside without alerting anyone. His preparation was meticulous. He carried restraints, gloves, and a small duffel bag containing tools he intended to use to immobilize the family. Ajay's plan was cruelly calculated. He sought to assert dominance and inflict psychological terror before any act of physical violence. The intrusion began silently, a shadow moving through spaces the family considered safe. Once inside, Ajay encountered Annika, who was practicing dance routines in the living room. He seized her before she could react, covering her mouth to stifle screams. Terrified, she struggled and attempted to flee, but he restrained her with cloth ties from the duffel bag. Priya, alerted by the commotion, ran to the living room, only to be confronted by Ajay's threatening presence. He forced her to the ground and restrained her as well, his voice low but menacing, insisting that no one alert authorities or escape. The situation escalated rapidly. Ajay's intent was clear. He wanted control over the family, believing that through terror and domination, he could manipulate Priya into responding to his obsession. Rajesh, returning moments later, was met with a horrifying scene. His wife and daughter restrained, his son hiding under the dining table. The confrontation turned violent almost immediately, with Rajesh attempting to physically subdue Ajay. Despite his efforts, he was overpowered, struck repeatedly, and forced to the floor alongside his family. For over 3 hours, the Desmuck family endured a nightmare within their own home. Ajay demanded information about finances, threatened physical harm, and imposed humiliating psychological torture. He forced Priya to send messages to coworkers and friends, attempting to isolate her from the outside world while projecting an illusion of normalcy to anyone attempting contact. His demands became increasingly erratic, alternating between threats, implausible requests, and moments of intense anger. The children were terrified, unable to comprehend the motives of a man who had invaded their sanctuary. Their pleas went unheeded as Ajay's obsession and aggression intensified, culminating in acts of assault against Priya and Annika that would later be documented during the investigation. Despite the trauma, Rajesh sought opportunities to protect his family. Using a moment when Ajay's attention wavered, he attempted to negotiate with the intruder, appealing to his sense of humanity and reasoning that violence would bring inevitable police intervention. Ajay's responses were erratic, alternating between anger and brief moments of calm, reflecting a psychological instability that amplified the danger. He forced the family into a bedroom, restraining them further, and at one point left the apartment briefly to collect additional items from a nearby convenience store, unaware that neighbors had begun noticing unusual activity and recording license plates of vehicles parked near the building. These small observations would later prove crucial in identifying the perpetrator. At approximately 11:45 p.m., Ajay returned, but the delay had created an opening. Neighbors who had witnessed the intrusion called the police, providing detailed information about the suspect, his vehicle, and movements. Local law enforcement units, already patrolling the area due to routine evening shifts, arrived within minutes, coordinating a response that balanced urgency with caution to prevent further harm to the hostages. Ajay, realizing that authorities were converging, panicked. He attempted to flee the apartment, leading officers to engage in a tense standoff in the corridor outside. Shouts, commands, and warnings were exchanged, while the Desmuck family remained restrained inside, terrified for their lives. The officer's presence ultimately forced Ajay into a corner, where he surrendered after brief negotiation, unaware that any violent escalation would likely have resulted in his immediate incapacitation. The Desmuk family was freed unharmed physically, though the psychological impact was profound. Counseling services were immediately offered, with mental health professionals emphasizing trauma processing, coping strategies, and long-term recovery. The children, particularly Annika, experienced nightmares, heightened anxiety, and regression in social behavior, necessitating intensive therapy. Priya and Rajesh faced persistent fears about safety, compounded by awareness of the stalker's previous obsession and the ease with which he had infiltrated their home. The incident prompted discussions with neighbors, the building management, and local authorities about security measures, awareness, and the need for vigilance in urban environments where population density can mask individual criminal intent. Law enforcement and investigative teams worked tirelessly to build a case against Ajay Kulkarni. Digital evidence, including cell phone records, social media interactions, and prior harassment complaints, established a clear pattern of stalking and premeditation. Forensic analysis of the apartment confirmed that Ajay had entered through forced entry, with fingerprints and trace evidence linking him to multiple points of contact. Witness testimony, including that of neighbors and individuals at nearby shops, corroborated the timeline and provided additional context for his movements. Police compiled an airtight case demonstrating intent, planning, and the potential for further harm had intervention not occurred when it did. In the days following the Desmuk home invasion, the city of Mumbai grappled with a mix of relief, outrage, and deep unease. News of the incident spread rapidly across national media, painting a vivid portrait of a family terrorized in the supposed safety of their own home. Television channels, newspapers, and online platforms highlighted not only the harrowing details of the attack, but also the heroism of neighbors who had alerted authorities and the professionalism of the Mumbai police in bringing the situation to a peaceful resolution. While the Desmuk family was physically unharmed, the psychological trauma was immediate and profound. Priya and Rajesh found themselves waking in the middle of the night, hyper-aware of every sound and movement. The children were reluctant to sleep alone, clinging to their parents and struggling to regain a sense of normalcy. Counselors worked intensively with the family, employing cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure techniques, and family sessions to address the layers of fear and anxiety that had been triggered by the intrusion. Meanwhile, investigators began delving deeper into Ajay Kulkarni's life, uncovering a history of escalating criminal behavior and psychological instability. His prior convictions for burglary and assault, coupled with a series of restraining orders, painted a picture of a man whose criminal tendencies had gone unchecked despite multiple interactions with the justice system. Interviews with former neighbors, teachers, and colleagues revealed a pattern of obsessive behavior toward women, particularly those in professional settings, as well as signs of social isolation and resentment. Mental health professionals who examined records post-arrest noted that Ajay displayed traits consistent with obsessive-compulsive tendencies, narcissistic tendencies, and untreated mood disorders. His fixation on Priya, while extreme, was consistent with a long-standing pattern of boundary violations, harassment, and escalating violence toward women who had rejected or spurned his advances. Law enforcement faced the additional challenge of piecing together a timeline that demonstrated premeditation and intent. Forensic analysis of the apartment revealed that Ajay had brought in tools designed for restraint, had studied the family's routines over a period of weeks, and had acquired illegal firearms to ensure control over the situation. Investigators compiled digital evidence, including location data from his mobile devices and communications sent to Priya and mutual acquaintances, to establish that the intrusion was not a spontaneous act, but a carefully orchestrated attack. Witness testimony from neighbors confirmed that Ajay had been observed surveilling the building repeatedly in the days leading up to the event, and security footage captured him entering and exiting the vicinity during critical times, all of which strengthened the case for premeditation. The cumulative evidence painted a chilling portrait of a man who had meticulously planned an act of terror against a family he had obsessively fixated upon. The legal proceedings began in late 2015, just months after Ajay's arrest. Prosecutors filed charges including attempted murder, unlawful confinement, assault, harassment, and possession of illegal firearms. The case drew widespread attention, not only because of the violent intrusion itself, but also due to the broader social implications regarding stalking, domestic violence, and the effectiveness of law enforcement in preventing repeat offenses. Public sentiment strongly supported a thorough and uncompromising approach, emphasizing the need for justice not only to punish Ajay, but also to set a precedent that obsessive and violent behavior would not be tolerated. Human rights advocates and victim support organizations became involved, offering guidance and emotional support to the Deshmukh family while emphasizing systemic improvements to prevent similar incidents. Throughout the trial, the narrative unfolded in meticulous detail. Priya's testimony described the hours of fear and terror she had endured, the ways in which Ajay had manipulated, threatened, and assaulted her, and the moments when she feared for the lives of her children. Arav and Anika's statements, given with the support of child psychologists, conveyed their perceptions of the attack, the terror they experienced, and the lingering impact on their daily lives. Rajesh's testimony highlighted his attempts to protect his family, the physical confrontation with Ajay, and his awareness of the danger that the intruder posed. These testimonies were supplemented by forensic evidence, including fingerprints, trace DNA, digital footprints, and surveillance footage, all of which corroborated the victims' accounts and established an unbroken chain of premeditation and intent. The prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of Ajay's actions, noting that he had studied the family's routines, observed security measures, and prepared tools for restraint and control. The legal argument centered on demonstrating that the intrusion was not impulsive, but a pre-planned act designed to terrorize and dominate the Deshmukh family. Witnesses provided context regarding his prior criminal behavior, showing a pattern of escalating obsession and violence. Expert testimony from psychologists and criminologists illustrated how individuals with obsessive tendencies and untreated psychological disorders can progress toward increasingly dangerous behavior if left unchecked, particularly when they have access to means of inflicting harm. The courtroom proceedings were detailed and methodical, ensuring that every aspect of Ajay's planning, motivation, and execution was laid bare for the jury. Outside the courtroom, the Deshmukh family began participating in advocacy efforts to raise awareness about stalking and domestic violence. Priya and Rajesh engaged with local organizations to highlight the warning signs of obsessive behavior, the importance of securing homes and digital communication, and the critical role of community intervention. Their efforts included public speaking, interviews, and collaboration with law enforcement to develop educational materials aimed at helping families recognize and respond to potential threats. Arav and Anika also participated in age-appropriate outreach initiatives, helping other children understand personal safety and the importance of alerting adults to concerning behaviors. The trial concluded in early 2016 with a conviction on multiple counts. Ajay Kulkarni was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, receiving multiple consecutive sentences that ensured he would have no opportunity for early release. The judge emphasized both the premeditated nature of the crime and the broader social impact, stating that the sentence served as a deterrent and a warning to others who might engage in obsessive, threatening, or violent behavior. The legal victory provided a measure of closure for the Desmuck family, though the emotional and psychological work of recovery remained ongoing. Counseling and therapy continued, focusing on trauma, resilience, and reclaiming a sense of security in daily life. In the months that followed Ajay Kulkarni's conviction, the Desmuck family began the slow and painstaking process of rebuilding their lives, though the psychological scars remained deeply embedded. Mumbai, with its constant energy and ceaseless motion, seemed at once familiar and alien. Simple routines, once taken for granted, now carried heightened vigilance. Priya found herself double-checking locks, monitoring entryways, and constantly scanning for potential threats, a behavior reinforced by the intrusion she had endured. Rajesh, once confident in the security of their home, grappled with a persistent sense of vulnerability, feeling that the safety of his family had been violated in a manner that no physical barrier could fully prevent. The children struggled with nightmares, fear of strangers, and lingering anxiety, requiring continued support from mental health professionals who emphasized trauma-informed care and gradual exposure to everyday environments that now felt unpredictable. The impact of the home invasion rippled through the community as well. Neighbors who had previously assumed that their own lives were insulated from such extreme danger began reassessing personal and building security. Apartment complexes across Mumbai invested in better surveillance, more attentive security personnel, and reinforced access points. Local authorities initiated community meetings and awareness programs, educating residents about recognizing stalking behaviors, reporting suspicious activity, and protecting vulnerable individuals. These community-driven initiatives underscored that the Desmuck case was not merely a private tragedy, but also a cautionary tale, highlighting systemic vulnerabilities in urban security, law enforcement responsiveness, and social vigilance. At the societal level, the case sparked national discussions about stalking, domestic violence, and the legal frameworks designed to protect victims. While Ajay's prior criminal record included multiple instances of harassment and assault, gaps in enforcement and monitoring had allowed his behavior to escalate unchecked. Advocacy groups highlighted these systemic failures, pushing for stricter enforcement of restraining orders, improved tracking of repeat offenders, and greater emphasis on preventive intervention. Policymakers debated measures to strengthen protective laws, emphasizing the importance of early reporting, thorough investigation, and the provision of support services for victims. The Desmuck case became a reference point for legislation discussions in Maharashtra and other states, emphasizing that legal mechanisms must adapt to the realities of stalking and obsession in densely populated urban areas. The family's recovery process was facilitated in part by participation in counseling programs that combined individual therapy, family therapy, and community support. Priya attended regular sessions with a psychologist specializing in post-traumatic stress disorder, learning coping strategies to manage anxiety, hypervigilance, and intrusive memories. Rajesh engaged in workshops focused on trauma-informed parenting, understanding how his children were processing the event, and fostering resilience in the face of fear. Arav and Annika benefited from specialized child counseling, group therapy sessions with peers who had experienced similar stressors, and structured activities designed to rebuild confidence and social engagement. These interventions were crucial in mitigating the long-term effects of trauma and helping the family reestablish a sense of safety within their home and broader environment. The media continued to cover the case extensively during the trial and for months afterward, often emphasizing both the horror of the intrusion and the successful intervention by law enforcement. Television interviews, newspaper articles, and online platforms focused on the meticulous planning by Ajay, the courage of the neighbors who alerted authorities, and the professionalism of the Mumbai police in safely resolving the standoff. While some coverage was sensationalized, much of it also highlighted the lessons learned. The importance of community awareness, the need for timely reporting of stalking behaviors, and the critical role of law enforcement coordination in preventing harm. Priya and Rajesh were selective about their engagement with the media, choosing to use public attention to educate others about the warning signs of obsessive behavior and the resources available for victims of harassment. In addition to psychological and legal recovery, the Deshmukhs undertook measures to enhance personal and technological security. Their apartment was retrofitted with reinforced locks, alarm systems, and CCTV monitoring. Digital privacy measures were implemented to prevent unsolicited contact or harassment via email and social media platforms. Neighborhood watch initiatives were established, encouraging residents to observe unusual activity and report concerns promptly. The family also engaged in educational outreach, visiting local schools and community centers to discuss personal safety, situational awareness, and the importance of communicating discomfort or fear to trusted adults. These efforts were motivated not only by a desire to protect themselves, but also by a broader commitment to preventing similar incidents from occurring within the community. The legal consequences for Ajay Kulkarni continued to unfold after sentencing. Appeals were filed, but the robust evidence, including eyewitness accounts, forensic documentation, and detailed testimony from the Deshmukh family, upheld the conviction. Ajay remained incarcerated, serving consecutive sentences that reflected the gravity of his crimes and the broader societal imperative to deter such behavior. The courts emphasized the premeditated nature of the attack and the psychological impact on the victims, underscoring that the sentence was intended not only as punishment, but also as a safeguard for the community and a deterrent against future acts of stalking and home intrusion. Psychologists and criminologists studied the case extensively, seeking to understand the underlying factors contributing to Ajay's behavior. Analyses highlighted the interplay of social isolation, untreated mental health issues, prior criminal behavior, and obsessive fixation, emphasizing that such incidents are rarely impulsive and often represent the culmination of escalating patterns that could be addressed earlier with effective intervention. Studies were published in journals examining the role of stalking, obsessive behavior, and the importance of early detection in preventing violent escalation. The Deshmukh case became a focal point for research on urban safety, psychological assessment of potential offenders, and the development of protocols for law enforcement response to domestic threats. As the years progressed, the Deshmukh family gradually reintegrated into daily life. They remained vigilant but increasingly resilient, drawing strength from the support of extended family, friends, and their community. The children returned to normal schooling, excelling academically and participating in extracurricular activities, though always under the watchful guidance of their parents and mental health professionals. Priya and Rajesh continued advocacy work, combining personal healing with efforts to educate others about stalking, obsessive behavior, and strategies to ensure safety. Their experience informed broader awareness campaigns, highlighting practical steps that families could take to protect themselves and encouraging community cohesion as a means of deterrence. The societal impact of the case extended beyond Mumbai. National discussions about stalking, domestic violence, and mental health awareness were informed by the details of Ajay's actions and the responses by law enforcement and the judiciary. Educational programs emphasized that obsession and harassment, if left unchecked, can escalate to violence, highlighting the importance of early intervention, community vigilance, and comprehensive legal enforcement. Workshops and seminars conducted by advocacy organizations used the Desmuk case as a case study, providing practical guidance for recognizing warning signs and implementing preventive measures in both private and public spheres. Over the following years, the Desmuk family story became a touchstone for discussions on public safety, domestic violence, and urban crime prevention across India. Priya and Rajesh committed themselves not only to healing but also to advocacy, working closely with NGOs, law enforcement agencies, and mental health organizations to raise awareness about the dangers of stalking, obsessive behavior, and home invasions. They shared their experiences at seminars, in schools, and through community programs, emphasizing practical measures families could take to enhance security, recognize early warning signs of obsession, and ensure that potential threats are reported before escalation occurs. Their goal was to transform the trauma they endured into a force for education and prevention, turning personal tragedy into a societal lesson. The children, Arav and Annika, gradually regained a sense of normalcy, though the emotional imprint of that night remained. Through years of therapy and family support, they learned coping mechanisms and resilience, growing into young adolescents with a heightened sense of empathy and awareness. Their experiences informed broader discussions in educational settings about safety, personal boundaries, and mental health awareness for children. Arav's teachers noted his maturity and leadership, while Annika's involvement in dance and music became a therapeutic outlet for expressing emotions and rebuilding confidence. Both children, guided by their parents and counselors, began participating in outreach programs aimed at educating peers about safety and resilience, using their story to help others navigate potential dangers. At the legal and institutional level, Ajay Kulkarni's case influenced policy discussions about the enforcement of restraining orders, monitoring of repeat offenders, and coordination between police and community organizations. Lawmakers and law enforcement officials examined gaps in the system that had allowed Ajay to escalate his behavior unchecked, implementing reforms that strengthened tracking of individuals with histories of harassment and violence. Community policing initiatives were enhanced, with officers trained to recognize the early signs of stalking and to work collaboratively with neighborhoods to protect vulnerable individuals. The case also sparked conversations about the role of mental health services in preventing violence, highlighting the need for accessible, early interventions for individuals exhibiting obsessive or aggressive tendencies. The media continued to cover the case, though over time the focus shifted from immediate sensationalism to analysis and reflection. Documentaries, news articles, and academic papers examined the psychological profile of Ajay Kulkarni, the systemic oversights that allowed his behavior to escalate, and the social and legal responses that ultimately protected the Desmuk family. Experts highlighted the importance of comprehensive approaches to public safety, emphasizing that prevention requires a combination of legal enforcement, mental health care, community engagement, and public awareness. The Desmuk family's experience served as a case study illustrating both the dangers inherent in untreated obsession and the power of coordinated intervention to avert tragedy. In the family's personal life, gradual restoration of routine became central to their recovery. They relocated to a new apartment in a nearby neighborhood with enhanced security measures, including keyless entry, CCTV coverage, and 24-hour security personnel. Priya and Rajesh established boundaries to maintain privacy and safety, implementing strict protocols regarding strangers, social media interactions, and external communications. They invested in both physical and psychological security, recognizing that recovery from trauma requires ongoing attention to both environmental and emotional factors. Over time, the children's confidence and independence returned, and the family was able to engage in social activities, travel, and community involvement with measured reassurance. Psychologists and criminologists continued to study the case, publishing research on stalking, obsession, and domestic intrusion. Their work emphasized the importance of recognizing early behavioral red flags, understanding the escalation pathways of obsessive individuals, and creating multidisciplinary response strategies that involve law enforcement, mental health professionals, and community organizations. Academic forums highlighted the Desmuk case as an example of successful intervention through a combination of community awareness and rapid police response, demonstrating that timely action can prevent physical harm even in situations with high potential for violence. Over time, the family's advocacy yielded tangible outcomes. Mumbai police incorporated lessons from the Desmuk case into training protocols, emphasizing rapid identification of potential threats, coordination with neighbors, and the importance of maintaining detailed records of prior harassment complaints. Schools and community organizations increased educational efforts about personal safety, teaching children and adults alike how to recognize inappropriate or obsessive behavior and how to respond effectively. The case became a reference point for policy discussions at state and national levels, influencing legislation aimed at protecting individuals from stalking, harassment, and domestic threats. The Desmuk family's resilience became a source of inspiration for others who had experienced or feared similar threats. Priya and Rajesh maintained a delicate balance between privacy and advocacy, using their story to educate while protecting their remaining sense of security. The children grew into teenagers with a strong awareness of personal boundaries, empathy for victims of violence, and a commitment to community engagement. Their experiences underscored the profound impact that timely intervention, support networks, and therapeutic care can have on recovery after a traumatic event. By 2020, 5 years after the incident, the Desmuk family had built a life defined by vigilance, awareness, and cautious optimism. While the trauma of that night could never be erased, they had established routines, security measures, and psychological support systems that allowed them to live without constant fear. Their story continued to serve as a cautionary tale, demonstrating both the dangers posed by obsessive individuals and the ways in which preparation, community engagement, and law enforcement responsiveness can prevent tragedy. The case also reinforced the broader lesson that urban environments, while vibrant and dynamic, require collective vigilance to protect vulnerable individuals and families. The legacy of the Desmuk case extended beyond Mumbai. Advocacy groups, educational programs, and mental health initiatives cited the incident as a pivotal example in training materials, seminars, and policy proposals. Researchers referenced the case in studies of stalking behavior, obsessive criminality, and the efficacy of rapid intervention in preventing escalation. Families, law enforcement officers, and community leaders across India examined the circumstances of the attack, learning from both the vulnerabilities exposed and the protective actions that ensured survival. Through public discourse and educational outreach, The Desmuck story became a benchmark for understanding the intersection of obsession, domestic intrusion, and community responsibility. Ultimately, the story of the Desmuck family is one of survival, resilience, and transformation. It illustrates the devastating potential of obsession and unchecked criminal behavior, while simultaneously demonstrating the power of coordinated response, community awareness, and psychological support. The family's journey from terror to recovery highlights the necessity of vigilance, preparedness, and advocacy in protecting vulnerable individuals. While the memory of that July night in 2015 remains a haunting presence, it has also catalyzed systemic improvements, fostered greater public awareness, and inspired efforts to prevent similar tragedies. The Desmuck family's experience serves as a reminder that even in the face of calculated violence, resilience, courage, and proactive intervention can preserve life, foster healing, and create a lasting legacy of awareness and protection. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Midnight. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious.